The path to the schoolhouse was never straight, even when it was cleared, because it followed the higher ground that stayed dry after thaw, and because feet had worn it that way long before anyone thought to measure distance. The building waited at the bend, low and timbered, its roof pressed down by stones to keep the wind from lifting it in winter, its walls darkened by smoke and years of damp. Inside, the benches were smooth where hands rested, and the floor remembered every season in stains and scuffs. The teacher arrived early, as he always did. Not by counting hours, but by the light moving across the meadow, the way the mist loosened its hold, the sound of birds shifting from one kind of calling to another. He laid out wax tablets when the air felt ready for them, and chalk when it did not, and sometimes neither, because the day is for listening instead. The door creaked. Children came in without hurry, their steps louder in frost, softer in mud, and the room took on the smell of wool and earth and bread crusts wrapped in cloth. The teacher did not ask what day it was, because the question had lost its edge and answers differed. He watched the way breath hung, then faded, and knew how long he could speak before fingers stiffened. He marked lessons by shadows sliding along the beam, by the sun touching the knot above the door, by the sound of the river when snowmelt thickened it. When numbers failed him, or rather when they ceased to agree with the sky, he let them go gently. He spoke of letters and of stories carried by travelers who remembered other ways of counting, and then he stopped when the light told him to stop. Outside, the field waited. At midday, which was not named as such, the children ate where they stood or sat, and the teacher stepped out to feel the wind. It came down from the hills in certain weeks, dry and sharp, and later it came softer, carrying the smell of turned soil. He had learned, after years of misjudging, to trust his skin more than his tablets. Bells from the village church sometimes sounded, but they were not always right, or the rope froze, or no one came to pull it, and so their voices drifted like advice rather than command. The teacher remembered when he had tried to keep count of weeks with notches, and how the notches crowded, then thinned, then lost their meaning as storms broke patterns apart. He set aside the stick and began to note instead when the swallows returned to the eaves and when the last of them left. It was enough. The same room held different sounds as the year leaned forward and then back. In early planting time, the scratching of chalk was interrupted by the distant clink of tools, and the teacher shortened his words because minds were already in the fields, later. When heat pressed against the shutters and flies traced slow loops, he opened the door and let the hum settle in, teaching patience by example. In winter, the fire spoke more than he did, and lessons were brief, folded between tending it and listening for the crack that meant more wood was needed. He measured those days by the way ash settled, by how many times the door opened to admit cold, by the silence that came after snow erased the path and no one arrived at all. He waited then. Years passed without being counted, but they left their marks anyway. The beam above the door sagged a little more, the bench legs were thinner, and the teacher's hair took on the color of lichen on stone. Children grew and stopped coming, replaced by others who knew the room as if it had always been there. Sometimes a stranger would sit in the back, a trader or a man sent by someone far away, and asked questions about calendars, about feasts kept on the wrong day, about how the village knew when to sow. The teacher answered by pointing, not at charts, but at the hills, at the river's edge, at the way the light fell on the far tree at a certain moment. The stranger would nod, or not, and leave. The room remained. Spring did not arrive all at once, and neither did lessons change quickly. The teacher noticed the damp lifting from the walls, the smell of rot replaced by green, and he allowed longer readings. He spoke of times when numbers mattered more. Not with regret, but with the tone one uses for distant relatives. He had once believed that losing. Count meant losing order, but order had returned in another form, quieter and more demanding. The children learned to watch as much as to listen, to feel when it was time to stop and when to begin. They learned that the same story sounded different depending on the wind outside, and that this difference was not an error. The river swelled. On one morning that felt like many before it, the teacher arrived to find Frost still holding in the shade, though the sun was warm. He hesitated at the door, listening to the drip from the eaves, counting nothing, weighing something he could not name. Inside, the benches waited, and outside, a lark rose straight up, then fell silent. He began the lesson without greeting, because greetings belonged to clocks. And he spoke until the light reached the knot above the door. When it did, he stopped, even though a sentence remained unfinished, and the children did not question it. They gathered their things and left, their footprints crossing and recrossing the path. The teacher stayed. He swept the floor slowly, following a pattern learned over time, pushing dust toward the threshold, pausing when his arm tired. He thought of how the seasons had taught him more than the tables he once kept. How time could be felt as weight rather than number. The room darkened as clouds passed, then brightened again, and he set the broom aside, standing in the doorway, watching the field where shoots were just visible, counting them without counting, waiting for the moment when the sound of the river would change again, because it always did. And because when it did, he would know to begin something else, or to stop, or to simply remain there, listening as the wind shifted and the light slid along the ground. And he wondered, briefly, whether the children would notice when he was no longer the one to open the door, or whether the room itself would remember, because it seemed to hold so much already. And as he stood there, feeling the day move past him, he lifted his hand as if to mark it, then let it fall, and waited for the next sign, which had not yet appeared. The next mornings arrived without announcement, and the teacher met them, as he always had, by the smell of damp grass and the way the cold lingered just a little longer in the hollows. He did not hurry. The path held puddles that reflected the sky in broken pieces, and he stepped round them by habit, knowing which would drain first and which would remain until the heat settled in for good. At the schoolhouse, he set his hand on the door before opening it, feeling the grain of the wood. The slight give warriors of pressure had softened it. Inside, the air was still, and he left it that way for a moment, allowing the room to wake on its own. Silence mattered. When the children came, they brought with them the outside world in fragments, a torn leaf stuck to a hem, a feather tucked into a sleeve, mud on boots that spoke of a field not yet ready. The teacher noticed these things more than their faces, because faces changed quickly. While the signs of the land moved at their own pace, he adjusted his words to match what he saw. When the river ran loud, he spoke less. When it settled back into its banks, he allowed longer pauses between thoughts, letting the children's attention stretch and rest. He no longer worried about whether they were keeping up, because keeping up had ceased to have meaning. Time did not move forward here so much as it circled. Some days, the lessons ended early because clouds gathered with a certain weight that meant rain would come hard and fast. On those days, the teacher sent the children away with a nod, trusting them to read the signs as he did. Other days, the sky stayed high and empty, and they lingered, tracing letters over and over, the repetition soothing rather than dull. He taught them to notice the small shifts, How the light on the floor changed when the sun crossed the roof beam. How the sound of footsteps outside altered when the ground dried. These were not written lessons, but they were learned all the same. The village beyond the field moved according to similar rules, though not everyone admitted it. There were arguments sometimes, quiet ones, about feast days and fasts that no longer aligned with expectation. The teacher listened when these concerns drifted into the room, carried by older children or by visitors who lingered after lessons. He did not offer correction. He had learned that insisting on alignment only deepened confusion. Instead, he spoke of waiting, of watching for the sign that came each year without fail. Even if its place on a table had shifted, some understood, some did not. The schoolhouse stood. As the year leaned further, warmth settled in layers rather than all at once. The teacher felt it in his joints before he saw it in the fields. He opened the shutters wider, letting air move through, carrying the smell of blossoms and distant smoke. Lessons stretched, then contracted, following no pattern anyone could chart. The children grew restless in the long light, and he let them stand, let them pace, because stillness had its season too, and this was not it. He spoke of journeys taken long ago, of people who crossed lands without maps, guided by stars that shifted slowly over lifetimes. He did not say how long those journeys took. No one asked. There were afternoons when no children came at all. On those days, the teacher remained anyway, sitting on the bench nearest the door, listening to the room breathe. Dust motes drifted in the light, slow and deliberate. He traced patterns on the table with his finger, not letters, just shapes that echoed the curve of the river and the line of the hills. He remembered when the room had been louder, when he had raised his voice to be heard over restless energy. Now, the quiet felt full rather than empty, as if the walls themselves were holding lessons waiting to be released. Outside, the seasons turned without pause. Autumn arrived first in the mornings, a thin edge of cold that made breath visible again. The teacher noticed how the children's shoulders hunched, how hands sought sleeves. He shortened lessons without explanation. Leaves gathered against the building, and he left them there until the wind decided otherwise. He spoke more of memory then, of how the land remembered footsteps long after they faded, how paths persisted even when no one walked them for a while. He did not say whether this was comfort or warning. Winter followed, patient and exacting. Snow changed the sound of everything, and the teacher adjusted once more, lighting the fire earlier, keeping lessons close to its warmth. He measured those days by the fire's needs, by how often it demanded attention, by how quickly it consumed what was given. The children came fewer at a time, sometimes not at all, and he accepted this without marking it down. When they did come, they listened more than they spoke, their eyes following the flames as much as his hand. The room held. There were moments, brief and unremarkable, when the teacher felt the weight of his years more clearly, not as sorrow, just as presence. He paused longer before standing. He let sentences trail off when the effort of finishing them outweighed their importance. He trusted the children to fill the space, or not. He had learned that meaning did not always require completion. Sometimes stopping was the lesson. One evening, after the light had faded enough that reading no longer made sense, he stayed by the door, watching the last of the children leave. Their voices carried faintly across the field, then disappeared. The sky deepened, and the first stars appeared, not counted, not named, simply acknowledged. He thought of how once he had tried to align them with days and months, and how they had resisted, shifting just enough to undo his certainty. Now, he watched them as markers of presence rather than measure, The wind changed. He closed the door. Gently, not because anyone had told him to, but because the air asked for it. Inside, the darkness settled in familiar layers, and he moved through them without stumbling. He set things in their places, not because order demanded it, but because the act itself marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. He did not define which. He sat for a while longer, listening to the building cool, to the distant river adjusting to night. Tomorrow would come, not as a number, not as a page turned, but as a shift in light, a change in sound, a feeling in the air that would tell him when to open the door again, when to wait, and when to speak. And as he sat there, breathing in time as it passed without asking to be named, he noticed a faint sound beyond the field, unfamiliar and yet not urgent, and he held, still, letting it approach or fade, and sure which it would choose and content, for the moment, to remain where he was listening. The sound returned on later days, never at the same moment, never with the same clarity, and the teacher learned not to look for it. It came when the air was thin, or when fog pressed low against the ground, or when the wind held still long enough for distant things to travel. Sometimes it was only a suggestion, like wood striking wood far away, or a voice carried unevenly across fields. He did not ask about it. Asking would have turned it into a measure, and measures had a way of insisting on answers. He continued as before. Morning followed morning. Though the shape of each differed, frost returned briefly, then withdrew. Leaving the earth dark and pliable, the path softened, and footprints blurred more quickly. Children arrived later on some days, earlier on others, guided by chores that answered to the land rather than the schoolhouse. The teacher adjusted without comment. He had long ago stopped expecting regularity, and in its absence he found a steadier rhythm. He spoke when the room was ready to hold words, and he fell silent when it was not. The benches creaked more now, wood shifted with temperature, and the building answered each change with small sounds. The teacher noticed them as one notices breathing, not consciously at first, then with a quiet awareness. He knew which boards complained in damp weather, which settled once the fire warmed them. He had come to understand the schoolhouse as something alive in its own slow way, responding to seasons as faithfully as the fields. When he swept, he followed the grain, not against it. When he leaned on the doorframe, he placed his weight where it had always been borne. The children learned this too, not through instruction, but through repetition. They sat where others had sat, touched the same worn places, listened to the same pauses. They grew accustomed to lessons that did not begin with announcement or end with dismissal. They learned to notice when the teacher's voice slowed, not because of secrecy, but because the day itself demanded softness. They learned that some questions were not meant to be answered quickly, and some not at all. Outside, work continued. Planting gave way to tending, tending to waiting. The fields changed color almost imperceptibly, green deepening, then lightening, then breaking into motion as wind passed through. The teacher watched from the doorway jogging. Pauses, tracking these shifts without naming them. He felt the weight of the sun differently now, heavier on his shoulders, lingering longer in the afternoons. He shortened his standing time accordingly, sitting more often, letting the room come to him. There were visitors again. Not many. A man with a bundle of papers once, asking about records that no longer existed. A woman traveling with children who stayed for a few days, uncertain of their direction. They sat quietly at the back, observing, perhaps puzzled by the absence of structure they expected to see. The teacher acknowledged them with a nod and continued. He had learned that explanation often created more distance than silence, When they left, the room returned to itself without effort. Summer settled in fully. Heat thickened the air, and lessons stretched thin. The teacher spoke less, relying more on gestures, on shared attention. He allowed the children to step outside when restlessness overtook them, trusting that they would return when ready. Some did, some did not. He made no mark of absence. He had learned that presence could not be forced without cost. The river dropped back into its bed, exposing stones that had not seen light since the previous year. He noticed this and adjusted his sense of the days accordingly. At night, sleep came differently. The teacher woke sometimes before dawn, not to a bell or a call, but to a feeling of completion or of beginning. He rose and sat by the small window, watching the sky pale. He thought of the many mornings he had greeted in this way, and of how few he could recall distinctly. They blended together, not as loss, but as continuity. He wondered briefly if this was how the land remembered time, not as a line, but as a surface worn smooth by passing. The unfamiliar sound returned more clearly one evening. It came from beyond the hills, rhythmic but uneven, like effort rather than signal. The teacher stood at the doorway longer than usual, listening. The children had gone. The field lay quiet, insects beginning their steady work. He did not move toward the sound. He did not retreat. He simply stood, letting it exist without interpretation. After a while, it faded, or perhaps he ceased to notice it. Drawn back into the smaller sounds of his immediate world, change did not announce itself. It arrived in small adjustments, a path worn slightly wider. A pause held a moment longer. The teacher found himself resting more often on the bench by the wall rather than the one near the door. He allowed the fire to burn lower before tending it. He trusted the room to hold its warmth. The children noticed these things without comment. They adapted as easily as he had once adapted. To the loss of numbers, autumn approached again, not as a date, but as a thinning of light. Mornings cooled. Leaves turned one by one, not together. The teacher resumed longer stories, knowing the season favored listening. He spoke of cycles without naming them as such, of returns that were never exact, of how something could be the same and different at once. He watched the children's faces, saw recognition there, or perhaps reflection, and let that be enough. The building aged quietly. A crack widened near the window. Rain found a new way in. The teacher placed a bowl beneath the drip and emptied it when it filled. He did not attempt repair beyond what was needed to continue. He had learned that holding on too tightly to form could hasten its failure. The room seemed to accept this care without complaint, offering shelter in return. The distant sound came more often now, still without pattern. Sometimes it coincided with clear skies, sometimes with cloud. The teacher began to associate it not with time, but with direction. It seemed always to come from the same place, though he could not say how he knew. He did not share this thought. He kept it as one keeps a stone in a pocket, felt occasionally, not examined. One afternoon, as light slanted sharply through the door, a child lingered after the others left. Not the youngest, not the oldest, just one who had learned to wait. The teacher did not prompt. They sat together in the quiet, listening to the building settle, to the wind moving through dry leaves outside. The teacher felt the moment stretch, not uncomfortably, but with a certain density, as if it were being asked to hold something. He said nothing. Eventually, the child stood and went. The teacher remained. He noticed then how the light no longer reached the knot above the door at. The same moment as before, it felt as short, leaving that familiar mark in shadow. He watched this carefully, not with concern, but with attention, aware that something had shifted again, subtly, as it always did, and that his task was not to correct it, but to recognize it, to adjust his waiting, his speaking, his opening of the door, and as the light faded further, and the room deepened into evening, he reached for the broom out of habit, then paused, listening once more to the faint sound beyond the hills, closer now. Or perhaps only clear in the cooling air, and he stood there, unsure whether to begin or to stop, holding that uncertainty without urgency, letting it settle round him like dusk. The next days carried a slight heaviness, not in the air itself, but in how it seemed to rest on things, lingering where before it had passed through. The teacher noticed it most in the mornings, when opening the door required a firmer pull, as if the hinges were reluctant to begin again. He did not rush them. He waited until the wood yielded, until the room accepted the light without protest. Inside, dust hung longer before settling, and the smell of old smoke clung faintly, even after the fire had been cold through the night. He adjusted without naming the change. Children continued to arrive, though their number varied more than before. Some came with new tasks pressing on them, their attention divided between the room and the fields beyond it. Others lingered longer, as if uncertain where they were most needed. The teacher allowed this uncertainty to remain. He spoke in shorter phrases, letting silence do more of the work. When he asked questions, he did not wait for answers. He had learned that questions themselves could shape thought, even when left hanging. The seasons moved as they always had, but their edges felt less certain. Autumn lingered, warm days interrupting cool stretches without pattern. Leaves fell, then held fast, then fell again. The teacher marked these shifts by opening and closing the shutters, by moving the benches slightly to catch or avoid the light. He no longer trusted his memory to tell him what usually came next. He trusted only what was present. The sound beyond the hills became part of this presence. It no longer startled him when it appeared. It arrived like weather, sometimes distant, sometimes near enough to suggest form without revealing it. The teacher noticed that the children heard it too. Their heads lifted, their hands paused. They did not ask what it was. Neither did he. The room held these moments without comment, absorbing the interruption as it absorbed everything else. Routine continued. The teacher swept, tended the fire, laid out materials when needed and left them untouched when not. He walked the edge of the field at the end of some days, not to measure its boundary, but to feel how far the ground had dried. Where grass gave way to earth, he noted new pots forming where feet chose easier passage. He did not crack them, pots. He had learned. Knew more than planners. There were mornings when the room remained empty long after it would once have filled. On those days, the teacher sat by the window, watching light shift across the floor. He listened to the building settle, to small sounds that spoke of age rather than use. He thought of the many hours that had passed here without wetness, of how the room seemed unchanged by absence. It was patient in a way people rarely were. Winter approached again, slowly, without urgency. Frost came and went. The fire was lit earlier some days, later on others. The teacher gauged its need by the way his hands responded, by how breath sounded in the room. Lessons drew closer to the hearth, voices lower, movements fewer. The children learned to read the fire as he did, adding wood when the flames thinned, stepping back when he pressed strongly. The building endured. Snow fell lightly at first, then heavier, altering sound once more. Footsteps muted, voices softened. The world beyond the schoolhouse receded, leaving the room feeling both smaller and more complete. The teacher spoke of memory again, not as something kept, but as something shaped by repetition. He traced a familiar story slowly, letting it settle differently in the quiet. The children listened, their attention steady, their stillness earned rather than enforced. One afternoon, the sound beyond the hills came closer than it ever had. It carried weight now, not loud, but undeniable. The teacher felt it in his chest before he fully registered it with his ears. He stood at the door, hand resting on the frame, and waited. The children sensed the shift and gathered their things without instruction. They left in small groups, glancing back once or twice, then disappearing into the muted landscape. The teacher remained alone. He did not follow the sound. He had learned that pursuit often distorted what it sought instead. He returned to the bench near the wall and sat, listening. The room responded as it always had, holding his presence without demand. He noticed the crack near the window had widened slightly, letting in a thin blade of cold air. He adjusted his position to avoid it, not out of discomfort, but awareness. Time continued its work. Days passed in this manner, marked only by changes in light and temperature, by the fire's appetite and the river's voice beneath the ice. The sound beyond the hills became familiar enough to fade into the background, then returned unexpectedly to claim attention again. The teacher accepted this rhythm. He had learned that familiarity did not mean control. Spring returned quietly, not with warmth at first, but with movement. Ice loosened. Water shifted. The teacher heard it at night. A subtle change beneath the silence. He opened the shutters wider, letting pale light in earlier. Children returned in greater numbers, carrying the smell of thaw with them. Mud clung to boots, laughter returned in brief bursts. The teacher allowed lessons to stretch again, then shorten. Responding to the energy in the room, the sound beyond the hills changed with the season. It softened, then sharpened, as if adjusting itself to the land's new state. The teacher noticed that it now carried a pattern he could almost follow, though he did not try. He held this awareness gently, knowing that naming it would alter it. He continued to teach as before, focusing on what was immediately present. The scratch of chalk, the warmth of sun on the floor, the way shadows gathered beneath the benches. Visitors came again. More this time. They stood outside first, observing, listening. Some entered and sat quietly. Others spoke briefly with the teacher at the door. He answered simply, without elaboration. He pointed when asked, not toward dates or directions, but toward features of the land that had guided him all these years. Some nodded and left. Others stayed longer, watching the room with an expression that mixed curiosity and hesitation. The schoolhouse held them all. As the days lengthened, the teacher felt a subtle shift within himself, not weakness, just a redistribution of effort. He stood less, he listened more. He allowed the children to lead portions of lessons, stepping back without announcement. They filled the space naturally, as if they had been preparing for it. He observed without pride or concern. This too was part of the pattern. One evening, as light lingered unusually late, the teacher remained by the doorway after the children had gone. The field glowed softly, and the hills beyond were clearly defined. The sound came again, closer now, carrying intention rather than accident. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He simply stood, feeling the day release its hold, aware that something was aligning, not in numbers or dates, but in presence. The wind shifted. He noticed how it carried the sound differently now, shaping it, clarifying it. He thought of all the signs he had learned to read, all the measures he had set aside. He did not feel the need to decide anything yet. Decision, he had learned, came after recognition, not before. He rested his hand on the doorframe, feeling its worn surface beneath his palm, grounding himself in what had not changed inside. The room waited, the benches, the hearth, the small window with its widening crack, the dust settling into familiar corners. The teacher remained where he was, balanced between inside and out, listening to the sound approach or perhaps simply reveal itself more fully. And he breathed evenly, allowing the moment to unfold without conclusion, without naming, holding it as he had held so many others, attentive and unhurried, ready to respond not when told, but when the land itself made clear what was being asked. The following weeks unfolded with a gentler insistence, as if the land itself had decided there was no need to hurry. Morning light arrived earlier, but it lingered behind thin cloud. Softening edges rather than sharpening them, the teacher opened the door each day with the same measured care, feeling for resistance, listening for the familiar sigh of wood easing into motion. Inside, the room accepted the light differently now. It spread wider across the floor, touching places it had not reached for some time. He noticed this. The children noticed it too. Though they said nothing, they took their places with a quieter confidence, as if the room had taught them where they belonged. Their movements were less abrupt. Their pauses lasted longer. The teacher adjusted his voice to match, lowering it when the air seemed full, lifting it slightly when attention drifted. He did not plan these changes. They emerged on their own, shaped by the day outside. The field continued its slow transformation. Green returned unevenly, thicker near the river, thinner where frost had lingered. Birds arrived in small groups rather than all at once, their calls tentative at first. Then, more assured, the teacher listened for them while speaking, allowing their rhythms to weave through his words. When a call repeated itself with insistence, he paused, letting it complete what he had begun. Silence followed. Not empty silence, the kind that settles after something has been understood without explanation. The children shifted, breathed, waited. The teacher did not rush to fill the space. He had learned that waiting could be a form of attention, and that attention, given freely, often returned something unexpected. The sound beyond the hills remained. It no longer felt distant, though it had not grown louder. It seemed closer because the teacher had grown accustomed to its presence, able now to hear its shape within the larger fabric of the day. Sometimes it arrived in the morning, threading itself through birdsong. Other times it emerged near dusk, carried on cooling air. It had become another signal, not of time, but of direction. Visitors continued to appear, though none stayed long. They watched the room, the teacher, the children. Some asked questions in low voices at the door. Others merely observed, their attention shifting between the building and the land round it. The teacher answered when asked. Briefly and without elaboration, he had learned that explanation often distracted from what could be seen directly. The schoolhouse stood steady. It bore the marks of years without complaint. The widening crack near the window admitted more light now, and sometimes a draught. The teacher placed a folded cloth there when the air grew sharp, removing it when warmth returned. He did not consider repair beyond this. The building had earned its imperfections, and they seemed to guide him as much as any instruction. Lessons changed again. Subtly, the teacher found himself asking the children to speak more often, not to test them, but to listen. Their voices carried the cadence of the fields, the pauses of work learned by watching rather than instruction. He noticed how they described things not by number, but by relation. The hill was higher than last year's snow line, the river louder than it had been before planting. These were measures that shifted with context, yet held their own consistency. He approved. Not aloud, approval felt unnecessary. Understanding revealed itself in the way the room held. Together, in how easily attention moved from one speaker to another, in the absence of hurry. The teacher leaned back more often now, resting against the wall, allowing the day to unfold without constant guidance. There were afternoons when the sound beyond the hills drew closer still. On those days, the teacher felt it before he heard it, a subtle tightening in the air, a sense of alignment rather than disruption. He did not stop the lesson. He did not alter his tone. He allowed the sound to pass through the room as another presence. Neither welcomed nor resisted. The children noticed, their eyes lifting briefly, then returning to what lay before them. This was enough. Spring gave way to early summer without a clear boundary. Warmth arrived in waves, retreating, then returning with more confidence. The teacher adjusted the shutters, the children adjusted their posture, and the room breathed with them. He spoke less of stories now and more of observation, guiding attention outward, then inward, then back again. He encouraged them to notice what remained when the obvious had passed. They listened. The river dropped once more, exposing stones smoothed by years of passage. The teacher took note of this, not as an event, but as a reminder. Change did not need announcement to be real. It left traces that could be read by those who took the time to look. Time continued, not forward, not backward, outward. The teacher felt this most keenly in the evenings, where he remained alone in the room after the children had gone. He sat on the bench by the wall, hands resting loosely in his lap, listening to the building settle. He could tell how warm the day had been by the length of the settling sounds, how dry by the way the boards responded. These were familiar conversations, carried out without words. The sound beyond the hills entered these evenings more frequently now. It carried shape and weight, not as threat, not as promise, but as presence. The teacher listened without attempting to place it. He had learned that some things lost their clarity when named too quickly. Instead, he allowed the sound to exist alongside the others, becoming part of the nightly pattern. One evening, as light thinned and shadows lengthened across the floor, the teacher did not rise immediately to close the door. He remained seated, watching how the last light traced the familiar marks on the wall. He noticed that it no longer reached the same point it once had, stopping short in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. He accepted this. The room darkened gradually, and the outside sounds grew more pronounced. Insects began their steady rhythm, the river spoke softly, and beneath it all, the sound from beyond the hills persisted. Closer now, clearer in its intent. Though still undefined, the teacher felt no need to move toward it. He was already where he needed to be. The next morning arrived quietly. Light filtered in through thin cloud, diffused and even. The teacher opened the door and felt the air move around him, warmer than expected, carrying the promise of another shift. Children arrived soon after, their steps sure, their voices low. The day began without announcement, as it always had. The teacher guided the lesson gently, then stepped back, allowing it to carry itself. He watched as the children spoke, listened, paused. He watched as the room held them, just as it had held so many before. He felt the sound beyond the hills again, threading its way through the day, no longer separate, no longer distant. And as the light moved across the floor, stopping once more just short of its old mark, the teacher lifted his hand slightly, not to signal an end or a beginning, but to acknowledge the shift he felt settling into place, and he held it there for a moment longer than before, listening closely, aware that something was nearing completion, or perhaps only becoming clear, and he waited, attentive and still, ready to respond when the moment itself decided to speak. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different, yet the teacher sensed a thinning, as if the space between moments had grown more permeable. Morning and afternoon no longer felt as distinct. Light lingered, then withdrew, without clear boundary, and he found himself less certain of when one part of the day had yielded to another. This uncertainty did not trouble him. It settled like a familiar weight, one he had learned to carry without effort. He continued to open the door first. The hinges spoke softly now, a sound shaped by long use rather than neglect inside. The room received the day with patience. Dust drifted, then found rest. The teacher placed his hand on the nearest bench, steadying himself not from weakness, but from habit. The bench was cool in the early hours, warming gradually as bodies arrived and settled. Children came in smaller clusters. They no longer rushed. They seemed to arrive when they arrived, neither early nor late, guided by something other than instruction. Some days they filled most of the room. Other days, only a few took their places, their presence somehow sufficient. The teacher greeted none of this aloud. He began when the room felt ready, when the air held enough attention to support words. He spoke less often now. When he did speak, his sentences were shorter, not from fatigue, but precision. He found that fewer words allowed the day to speak alongside him. He pointed sometimes, not to objects, but to moments, how a sound shifted, how light fell, how a pause felt different from the one before it. The children followed his attention without needing to know why. Outside, summer settled more fully. He'd pressed down in the afternoons. Flattening sound, slowing movement. The teacher opened the door wider, letting air pass through, carrying the scent of warmth and distant water. Lessons shortened of their own accord, when restlessness surfaced. He did not resist it. He let the children step outside, trusting that the room would draw them back when it was time. Often, it did. The sound beyond the hills became woven into the texture of these days. It no longer interrupted. It underlined. The teacher noticed that it carried variations now sometimes strained, sometimes steady, as if effort were being applied unevenly. He felt no need to interpret this. The sound existed. And that was enough. It joined the river, the insects, the wind, all speaking in ways that required attention rather than understanding. The building responded to. He'd caused the boards to expand, tightening joints, muting some creaks while amplifying others. The teacher adjusted his movements accordingly, stepping where the floor yielded more kindly. He had learned the building's moods as one learns another person's, through long acquaintance rather than study. There were afternoons when the teacher did not teach at all. He sat by the open door, watching the field shimmer in the heat. Children sat with him, or lay on the floor, or drifted in and out. No one suggested an activity. No one asked permission. The room held this idleness without judgment. The teacher listened to the slow exchange of breath and sound, aware that learning was taking place in a way he could not have designed. Late in the season, the visitors returned in greater number. They did not enter all at once. One would appear at the edge of the field, then another, standing apart, observing. Some spoke quietly among themselves, others simply watched. The teacher acknowledged them with a glance, then returned his attention to the room. He did not feel responsible for explaining what could be seen. When they entered, They did so carefully. They took seats at the back, or stood near the wall, their movements restrained. They seemed uncertain of their place, as if unsure whether they were meant to participate or merely observe. The teacher made no adjustment for them. He continued as before, trusting the room to instruct them as it had instructed him. The sound beyond the hills felt closer during these days, not louder, closer, as if distance itself had compressed. The teacher noticed that when it appeared, the visitors grew still, their attention sharpening. He did not look at them. He focused instead on the way the sound altered the room's atmosphere. Drawing awareness inward, evenings lengthened. Light lingered well into what had once been. Considered night, the teacher found himself staying later, not out of obligation, but inclination. He remained after the last child had gone, sitting in the open doorway, watching the sky deepen slowly. The stars emerged one by one, not in patterns he recognized, but in a scattering that felt deliberate. He did not count them. The sound arrived often at this hour. It carried a steadiness now, a rhythm that suggested repetition rather than approach. The teacher listened, breathing evenly, feeling no need to move. He thought of all the times he had waited for something to arrive, only to discover later that it had been present all along, requiring only patience to reveal itself. The next mornings came gently. The teacher woke earlier without knowing why. Light filtered through the window before he had expected it to, pale and even. He rose and sat quietly, listening to the world gather itself. When he stepped outside, the air felt balanced, neither cool nor warm. Holding the promise of change without urgency, children arrived with a similar quietness. They spoke less among themselves. Their movements were deliberate. The teacher sensed that they felt the thinning, the softening of edges. He allowed the day to unfold without structure, responding only when necessary. He felt no pressure to guide every moment. The schoolhouse seemed to breathe more deeply. Air moved through it with ease. The crack near the window admitted not just light, but sound, connecting inside and out more fully. The teacher did not block it. He welcomed the connection. Sensing that separation was becoming less useful, there came a day when the sound beyond the hills did not fade. It remained steady and present from morning into afternoon. The teacher noticed that it no longer drew attention away from the room, but anchored it. Lessons continued within its presence, shaped by it rather than interrupted. The children did not look toward the hills, they looked inward. Listening more closely, the visitors stood quietly. Some left, some stayed. None spoke. The teacher felt a subtle shift within himself, not physical, but directional. He found his attention drawn less to what came next and more to what was already complete. He spoke a final sentence that day without realizing it would be final, then fell silent, allowing the room to absorb it. No one prompted him to continue. The light moved across the floor, stopping again short of its old mark. The teacher watched this carefully. He felt no disappointment, only recognition. The room had adjusted, and so had he, as afternoon leaned toward evening. The children gathered their things without instruction. They left slowly, glancing back not out of concern, but acknowledgement. The teacher remained seated, listening as their footsteps faded. The sound beyond the hills continued. It no longer felt separate from the other sounds. It had become part of the day's structure, as natural as the river's voice or the insect's rhythm. The teacher sat with his hands resting loosely in his lap, feeling the warmth of the day leave the room. He did not rise immediately. He felt no need to mark the moment, no need to close the door quickly. He allowed the light to thin, the shadows to deepen, trusting that when action was required, the land would make it clear, as it always had, and as he sat there, balanced between inside and out, listening to the sound that now felt fully present rather than approaching, he waited, not for an ending, but for the next small adjustment, which had not yet revealed itself. The adjustment arrived without ceremony, as most important things did. It came in the way the teacher rose one morning and did not reach immediately for the door. He stood instead at the center of the room, letting the light find him where he was. It fell across his shoulders, softer than before, as if filtered through memory as much as cloud. He waited until the room felt awake. Only then did he move. The children arrived later that day, fewer than usual, their presence calm and unforced. They settled without direction. The teacher took his place among them rather than before them. Sitting on a bench worn smooth by decades of hands, he did not begin a lesson. He did not need to. The room already held what was required. Outside, the field rested. Summer had reached its fullness and paused there, not yet tipping toward decline. The air carried weight, but not strain. The sound beyond the hills was present, steady and grounded, no longer drawing attention to itself. It had become part of the day's breathing, inseparable from the river, the wind, the distant work of insects. The teacher noticed that he no longer listened for it. He simply listened. Time passed in the room without being shaped into segments. A child spoke briefly, then stopped. Another shifted position. Someone laughed softly, surprised by the sound. The teacher observed without directing, aware that what was unfolding required no correction. He felt the room holding him as he had held it for so long. Its patience now extended toward him. The light moved. It traced familiar paths along the floor, then diverged, stopping where it always stopped now. The teacher accepted this new boundary without reflection. Boundaries changed. That had been the lesson all along. He felt a deep familiarity settle over him, not tied to any single memory, but to the accumulation of moments that no longer needed sorting. The visitors did not return that day, nor the next. Their absence felt neither notable nor concerning. The room had always known how to be complete. Without witnesses, the teacher sensed that its work did not depend on being seen or understood, only on being present. In the days that followed, he spoke even less. When he did, it was to name what was already obvious: the warmth, the quiet, the way attention gathered when, given space. He found that his words now served more as acknowledgement than instruction. The children responded in kind, their awareness sharpening, their confidence steady. There came a morning when the teacher did not arrive before them. The children entered to find the room already open, the door wide, the air moving freely through. They took their places, uncertain at first, then settled. They waited. The teacher arrived later, walking more slowly than usual, though not with difficulty. He paused at the threshold, watching them, seeing how easily they had held the space. He did not interrupt. He took a seat near the wall and listened. The day unfolded without his guidance, and nothing was lost. The room absorbed the voices, the silences, the subtle shifts of attention. The teacher felt a quiet certainty form within him, not as decision, but recognition. The seasons had taught him well. That afternoon, when the light began to thin, he rose and stood in the doorway. The children gathered their things and left without prompting. One lingered briefly, then went. The field lay open before him, the hills steady beyond, the sound fully integrated into the world it had always belonged to. He closed the door gently inside. The room darkened as it always had. The benches waited. The hearth cool, the crack near the window admitted a final thread of light, then let it go. The teacher stood for a long moment, hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the building's familiar strength beneath his palm. He did not feel the need to return the next morning. Not because something had ended, but because it no longer required him in the same way. The room would continue. The children would return. Or not. The seasons would adjust themselves without instruction. Time would keep moving, not by number, but by presence. He stepped away quietly. Outside, the evening settled across the land with practiced ease. The sound beyond the hills remained. No longer distant, no longer new. The teacher walked the path as it curved gently away, his steps unmeasured, his pace. Unhurried, carrying with him no record, no count, only the deep familiarity of having listened long enough to know when to let the listening continue without him. The schoolhouse stood, the field breathed, and the seasons, patient and precise in their own way, kept time. The next morning arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly. Light crept through the cracks in the shutters, not in a rush, but inching its way across the worn floorboards, tracing the familiar patterns of benches and hearth. The teacher stood quietly in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the frame, feeling the temperature shift subtly from one side of the room to the other. Outside, the air was damp, carrying the scent of grass and distant water, and for a moment everything seemed suspended between one breath and the next. Children arrived soon after, but they moved differently now. Their steps were softer, more deliberate. They glanced toward the walls and the benches as if greeting old friends. The teacher said nothing, remaining where he had stood, listening to the small symphony of approaching feet and low voices. He noticed the way their shadows fell across the floor, stretching and contracting as the light moved, and how their eyes paused on the places where dust gathered, or where the sunlight traced the knot in the wood. He did not call them to attention. The room seemed to open round them, holding each in its own quiet way. A child shifted, then another, a brief exchange of looks passing between them without words. The teacher understood this as part of the lesson: presence, observation, patience. He made a small motion with his hand, not commanding, just acknowledging. And the children responded with ease, as though the room itself had spoken. Outside, the field was alive in subtle motion, grass bent under the wind, sunlight caught in the ripples of a distant stream, and the hills beyond seemed to hold a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound from the hills arrived again, faint and steady, threading through the space between the trees, through the space between breaths. It was not urgent. It did not demand attention. It was simply there, like the river, like the shifting light. The teacher noticed it, felt it, allowed it to coexist with the room's quiet life. He did not name it. The children worked with small objects brought from home: stones, sticks, scraps of cloth. They arranged and rearranged them across the benches, discovering patterns that appeared only when they stopped trying to force meaning. The teacher watched, seated near the wall, noting the patience in their movements. He adjusted nothing. There was no need. The space had learned to guide itself. Even the benches seemed to breathe differently. Wood expanded and contracted with the warmth and coolness of the room. Cracks widened slightly, then closed as if testing him. He felt the familiar tension in the floorboards underfoot, the slight tilt in the doorframe, and welcomed it all. These were small signs, subtle markers of time passing, of presence acknowledged, of care applied without insistence. Midday came without announcement. The children paused to rest, some leaning against benches, some lying on the floor, eyes tracing the beams above. The teacher did not speak. He leaned back and watched sunlight shift again, noticing how it fell across the walls, striking familiar marks. Then, leaving them, shadows lengthened slowly. Drawing attention to spaces that were usually overlooked, there was no hurry to change this pattern, no pressure to correct it. Everything was unfolding as it should later. The sound from the hills returned. It carried a weight now, neither threatening nor urgent, simply present. The teacher did not stand or move toward it. He let it fill the room alongside the murmurs of the children. The soft creak of benches, the distant rush of the river, it felt integrated, natural, inevitable. The children listened too, heads lifting briefly, then returning to their work. The teacher smiled slightly, not at them, not at the sound, but at the way everything could exist together without forcing clarity. Evening approached slowly, the sky shading from pale gold to deep blue. The children began to gather their things, speaking softly among themselves. No one called them to leave. They moved with the quiet ease of those who understood the rhythm of the space. The teacher remained seated, noticing the way the shadows deepened, how the floorboards absorbed the waning light, how the room responded to the gradual coolness. He allowed himself to feel the continuity, the steadiness of all that endured outside. The field was calm. The wind whispered through the grass, the river murmured beneath the ice melt, and the sound beyond the hills pulsed faintly, as if keeping time with the earth itself. The teacher felt it in his chest, a subtle vibration, a reminder that things need not always be named or counted to exist fully. Presence alone could. Hold everything. The children left without urging. One lingered briefly at the doorway, then another, until the room was empty, filled only with fading light and the small creaks of settling wood. The teacher stood, hands lightly brushing the tops of the benches, feeling the familiar shapes beneath his fingers. He paused in the doorway, inhaling the cool air, listening to the distant sound, to the rhythm of the river, to the soft chorus of insects that had begun their evening song. He did not move forward. He did not move back. He simply held the space between inside and out, aware of the way the day had shifted without fanfare, aware of how presence itself had become the measure of time. And as the shadows deepened further, and the light thinned to a quiet thread along the floor, he felt the land, the building, the children, and the distant hills settle round him, and waited, attentive, for whatever subtle shift might come next, without urgency, without expectation. Only listening. The next morning arrived with a faint chill, soft enough to be mistaken for the remnants of night rather than the touch of a new day. Light spilled unevenly through the shutters, brushing the floor in muted stripes, highlighting the dust motes that floated lazily in the still air. The teacher lingered at the door, feeling the faint tremor of the hinges under his hand. The world outside held its usual shapes, fields, hills, river, but something in their arrangement felt subtly different, as if time had nudged them slightly out of their usual alignment. Children arrived slowly. They carried the quiet of early light with them, their footsteps careful across the frost-cooled earth. There was no hurry, and no instruction seemed necessary. They moved naturally into the room, seating themselves as if they had always belonged to its rhythm. The teacher remained at the doorway, allowing their presence to settle round him, to fill the space as he had long learned it would. The sound beyond the hills returned, soft and persistent. It carried weight now, not in volume, but in shape. It threaded itself through the space outside, bending round the hills, brushing the trees, pressing gently against the edges of the field. The teacher did not react. He did not turn to see or measure. He simply let it be, noting its presence as one notes a familiar wind. The children sensed it too, pausing briefly, eyes lifting toward the distant rise, before returning to their quiet work. The room responded. Light, dust, and quiet conspired together. The benches creaked ever so slightly. The floor shifted beneath the teacher's weight, and the hearth seemed to breathe with the room. Inhaling warmth, exhaling absence, every surface carried the memory of years. Of lessons given and taken, of pauses and repetitions. The teacher leaned lightly against the wall, observing the way the day unfolded without interference. Time moved slowly, unmeasured. The sun climbed, then dipped. Moving across the room in a path only half recognizable from previous seasons, the teacher noticed the angles of shadows, how they lengthened and shortened against the walls. Tracing subtle changes in the errant light, he adjusted his posture to catch the faintest warmth on his hands, aware that each small sensation marked the day's progression more reliably than any count or calendar. Visitors appeared briefly, then withdrew. They did not speak much, simply standing at the edge of the field, watching the room and the children within it. The teacher did not greet them. He continued as he had, guiding only where necessary, allowing observation itself to become a lesson. Sometimes a visitor lingered longer, eyes tracing the light, the dust, the gentle movements of the children. Then they would leave again, quietly, as though the room had absorbed them without need of comment. Afternoons came and went without ceremony. The children rearranged small objects on the benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth. They worked with a careful patience, learning not through instruction, but through repetition and attention. The teacher watched, silent. He no longer felt the compulsion to correct, to shape, to measure. The room itself guided them now, and he trusted it completely. Evening approached gradually, light fading in thin layers rather than abruptly. The children gathered their things, moving slowly toward the door. Some lingered a moment, glancing back at the benches, the hearth, the light that slanted across the floor. The teacher remained seated near the wall, hands resting lightly in his lap. He felt the warmth of the day ebb, the room settle. The air shift subtly as the outside sounds the river, the wind. The distant hills rose to fill the quiet left by departing feet. He did not rise immediately. He watched shadows deepen across the floorboards, noted the faint tremor in the old wood of the walls, the way the dust settled in pools where the light no longer reached. The sound beyond the hills persisted, threading through the evening air, neither urgent nor faint, simply present. He inhaled slowly, aware of the way presence itself seemed sufficient. Enough to measure the day's passage. Enough to hold attention without words or numbers. The wind shifted slightly, brushing across the field, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant blooms. The teacher felt it in his chest, a gentle rhythm echoing the room's own pulse. He did not move to follow it, nor to resist it. He simply let it wash over him, noting its pattern without naming it. The benches, the hearth, the floor, the dust, the slant of light all settled round him as witnesses to the quiet, a continuity older than instruction, older than sound, older than counting itself. He remained at the doorway. The children had gone. The room absorbed their absence as naturally as it had absorbed their presence. The sound beyond the hills continued its steady murmur, now indistinguishable from the soft chorus of the river and the rustling of leaves. The teacher breathed evenly, listening without need for a comprehension, holding his place between inside and out, between light and shadow, between the day that had been and the one yet to arrive, aware that the next shift, whatever it might be, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would wait quietly, attentively, as he had always waited. The day deepened slowly, without urgency, as if the sun itself had learned to move in deliberate, measured increments, Light filtered through the shutters in thin, pale stripes, painting the dust in the room with patterns that shifted imperceptibly with the angle of the sun. The teacher stood in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the wormwood, feeling the subtle tremor of the hinges beneath his fingers. Outside, the field stretched quietly, still marked by frost in shaded patches, while the hills beyond held their familiar shapes, though somehow softened, as if time had pressed against them gently and left a new contour. The children arrived in small clusters, moving without the hurried energy of past seasons. Their footsteps were measured, their glances cautious, and they carried with them the faint scent of dew-dampened grass. They settled into the room, naturally, each finding a place where their presence fit into the rhythm of the space. The teacher remained at the threshold, not calling them forward, not directing. He simply observed, aware that the room itself would guide them if he allowed it. A soft sound reached them from beyond the hills. It was faint, persistent, almost indistinguishable from the rustling of leaves or the low murmur of the river, yet it carried weight, not in volume, but in presence. The teacher did not turn to measure it. He did not seek its source. Instead, he let it exist alongside the room, alongside the children, alongside the light and shadow. The children noticed it, subtly shifting in posture, listening, then returning to their work without question. The room responded to them all. Sunlight caught on benches, dust motes drifted in lazy arcs, the hearth exhaled faint warmth into the cool air. Every surface seemed aware of its occupants, as if it too understood the quiet, the attention, the patience required to inhabit this space fully. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting on his knees, and simply allowed the day to unfold, unmeasured by clock or lesson plan. Midday came and went without fanfare. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards, then shifted slightly with the movement of clouds outside. The children paused intermittently, not because they were instructed, but because the room itself seemed to hold a rhythm that demanded stillness. They observed one another, rearranged small objects on the bench of stones, twigs, scraps of cloth, and discovered patterns that emerged only through careful attention. The teacher watched, silent, allowing their exploration to unfold as naturally as sunlight bending across the floor. Evening approached quietly. The children gathered their things, speaking softly among themselves. No instruction was necessary. They moved toward the door with deliberate calm, lingering just long enough to glance at the familiar spaces they had inhabited that day. The teacher remained seated, noticing the faint tremor of settling wood beneath his hands, the way the dust collected where the light no longer reached. The sound from the hills persisted, blending into the chorus of river, wind, and distant insects, neither commanding nor retreating. He did not rise. He stayed in the doorway, feeling the temperature shift subtly as day yielded to evening. Light thinned across the floorboards, shadows deepened against the walls, and the air carried the faint warmth of the departing sun. Presence itself had become the measure of time, marking each moment not by count or schedule, but by the steady pulse of the room, the children, the world beyond the hills. The wind shifted, stirring the grass in the field outside. It carried the faint scent of earth and the promise of early blooms. The teacher felt it against his skin, felt the rhythm of it in his chest, and did not move to chase it. He let it pass, noticing only its presence, acknowledging its continuity alongside the room. The light, the children, and the distant hills, each element existed in harmony and measured, and forced, and entirely sufficient. He remained at the doorway. The children had gone, leaving behind quiet footsteps and the soft echo of small movements. The room absorbed their absence as it had absorbed their presence, carrying memory without need of words. The sound beyond the hills persisted, steady and familiar. Now no longer separate from the murmuring river, the rustling leaves, or the faint hum of insects in the cooling evening air. The teacher breathed evenly. He held the space between inside and out, between light and shadow, between what had been and what was to come. He waited as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without the need to understand fully, aware that the next small shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, poised between presence and absence, ready to continue the quiet rhythm of days that measured themselves not in numbers, but in the patient unfolding of what was already there. The morning arrived with a pale, diffused light, softer than the previous days, as if the sun itself were moving more cautiously across the sky. The teacher stood in the doorway, feeling the slight chill in the air and noticing how the shadows from the shutters stretched longer across the floor than before. Outside, the field was muted, still damp in places where dew had lingered overnight, and the hills beyond held the same contours, familiar yet subtly altered by the shifting light. The air carried the faint scent of soil and water, pressing gently against the building. And for a moment everything seemed to pause between one breath and the next. The children arrived. Slowly, in pairs and trios, their movements deliberate and unhurried. Their footsteps on the frost-touched ground made soft impressions, and they entered the room quietly, settling into spaces that seemed to have been waiting for them. The teacher did not call their attention. He remained in the doorway observing how the room adjusted itself round their presence, noting the way light and dust shifted, how the benches accepted the weight of small bodies, and how the air felt fuller simply for their being there. The distant sound from the hills returned, persistent but unobtrusive. It carried a faint, steady rhythm, threading itself through the field, round the river and into the room. The teacher did not attempt to locate it. He did not name it or measure it. Instead, he allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the slow movement of dust motes drifting lazily in the beams of sun. The children sensed it as well, pausing briefly in their tasks, listening without speaking, then returning to their quiet work. Time moved with gentle insistence. The sun climbed higher, shifting the patterns of light across the benches and floorboards. The teacher leaned lightly against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day carry him. He did not push, he did not direct, he did not interrupt. He simply observed the subtle variations in shadow, the sway of grass outside, the low murmur of river and wind. Each element held its place. Each measured its own presence without human interference. No visitors appeared that day, and yet their absence made no difference. The room had always held its own authority, its own quiet lessons, teaching not through words alone, but through the persistence of its presence. The teacher felt the familiar reassurance of this, allowing it to settle across his shoulders like a warm cloak. He observed the children rearranging small objects, stones, sticks, scraps of cloth on the benches, finding order in repetition, patience in patterns that revealed themselves only when left to emerge naturally. Afternoon crept forward. The light shifted imperceptibly. The children paused from time to time, exchanging brief glances, their attention moving outward and inward without the need for direction. The teacher remained seated near the wall, noting the way their attention, the dust, and the sound from the hills all wove together into a slow, continuous rhythm. It was not forced. It was not guided. It simply existed, and in that existence, it was complete. Evening began to descend with familiar ease. The children gathered their belongings and began to leave, quietly and without instruction. One paused at the doorway, then another. Glancing back at the benches, the floor, the light that had traced familiar pots across the room, the teacher remained seated, watching them go, feeling the subtle pull of absence fill the room without diminishing its presence. The sound beyond the hills continued, steady and unremarkable in its constancy, blending seamlessly with the murmur of the river and the soft whisper of leaves stirred by the wind. He did not rise. He stayed where he was, aware of the faint tremor in the floorboards, the cool touch of shadows stretching across the room, the way the dust collected where sunlight no longer reached. Presence had become the measure of the day. Not numbers, not lessons, not instruction, just being. Steady and sufficient, the wind shifted across the field. It carried the scent of wet earth and early blooms, brushing gently against the schoolhouse, touching the edges of the open door. The teacher felt it on his skin and in his chest, allowing it to pass without movement, without attempt to chase or follow. It existed as part of the room, part of the day, part of the world beyond the hills. He remained in the doorway. The children had gone. The room absorbed their absence as naturally as it had absorbed their presence. The distant sound persisted, threading through the evening air, blending with the river, the wind, and the faint chorus of insects that had begun their quiet song. The teacher breathed slowly, evenly, holding the space between inside and out, between light and shadow, between what had been and what might come next. He waited as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next small shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, poised between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by numbers, but by the unfolding of what was already there. The morning arrived with a softness that almost seemed to hover, neither warm nor cold, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and lingering frost. Light seeped through the shutters in thin, hesitant streams, brushing the floorboards and the benches with a quiet insistence. The teacher stood in the doorway, hand resting on the worn wood, feeling the subtle vibration of the hinges beneath his palm. Outside, the field lay still, the grass heavy with moisture, bending slightly under the weight of overnight dew. The hills beyond were muted, their edges softened, as if the world had taken a breath and held it there for a moment. The children came slowly, one by one. Their movements were measured, gentle, as if the very air of the room demanded patience. They did not rush. They did not speak loudly. They settled into spaces that seemed to have been waiting for them all along. The teacher remained at the threshold, neither calling them forward nor guiding them, simply observing how the room adjusted itself to their presence, how dust drifted lazily in the light, how benches accepted weight without protest, and how the air carried a calm that seemed almost tangible. The sound from the hills returned. It was faint, rhythmic, persistent, threading itself through the field, the distant river, the whispering trees. It did not demand attention, and yet it held it, drawing awareness without insistence. The teacher did not seek it. He did not name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the gentle creaks of the benches and the soft shifting of dust motes. The children noticed it in small, imperceptible ways, pausing their movements, tilting their heads. Then returning to their work, time passed slowly. The sun climbed higher, shifting the patterns of light across benches and floorboards. Shadows lengthened, shortened, shifted again as clouds passed above. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting lightly on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day carry him. He did not push, did not direct, did not interrupt. He simply observed, noticing the subtle variations of light, the sway of grass in the field, the murmuring river. Each element held its place. Each measured its own presence, steady and sufficient. No visitors came that day. Their absence was inconsequential. The room had always taught itself, always held its own authority. The teacher felt the familiar reassurance of this. Letting it settle over him, the children rearranged small objects on the bench's stones, twigs, scraps of cloth, discovering patterns that appeared only when left to emerge naturally. Their attention was gentle but precise, as if the room itself had guided them without word or gesture. Afternoon deepened slowly. The light shifted imperceptibly, falling across the floor and benches in long, quiet arcs. The children paused from time to time, exchanging soft glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering small spaces of rhythm within the room. The teacher remained seated. Watching his presence itself became the lesson. Each movement, each pause, each subtle breath forming a pattern larger than instruction or intent. Evening began to settle. The children gathered their things and departed quietly. Some lingered briefly in the doorway, glancing back at the benches, the hearth, the familiar light that traced long paths across the floor. The teacher stayed seated near the wall, observing the subtle tremor in the boards, the thinning light, the cool settling of the air. The sound from the hills continued, steady and familiar, no longer separate from the chorus of the river, the wind, and the distant insects beginning their night song. He did not rise. He stayed in the doorway, feeling the cool of the shadowed floor beneath his feet, the soft draft of air brushing against his shoulders. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned, sufficient. The wind shifted gently across the field. It carried the scent of damp soil and the faint hint of blooms yet to open. The teacher felt it against his skin and in his chest, letting it pass through without movement, without pursuit. It was part of the room, part of the day, part of the steady rhythm that had outlasted instruction, schedule, even voice. He remained in the doorway. The children had gone. The room absorbed their absence as it had absorbed their presence. The sound from the hills persisted, now indistinguishable from the murmuring river, the rustling leaves, the distant insects. The teacher breathed evenly, quietly, holding the space between inside and out, light and shadow, between what had been and what might come. He waited as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for a comprehension, aware that the next small shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, poised between presence and absence, ready to continue the slow rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the patient unfolding of what was already there. A faint streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, carrying with it the slow warmth of the day's passing. The teacher watched it, unmoving. As the shadows deepened round it, the floorboards creaked softly, and the air itself seemed to pause for a heartbeat before continuing. The sound from the hills carried steadily, threading through the quiet room, through the bending field, through the darkening hills beyond, and in that moment, the teacher noticed the shift, the smallest, subtlest change. Barely perceptible, but enough to draw his full attention, enough to remind him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. The morning arrived thin and pale, as though the sun had taken its time in rising, and the light that fell through the shutters was quiet, scattered into gentle stripes that lingered across the benches and floorboards. The teacher stood in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the wormwood, feeling the faint tremor of the hinges beneath his fingers. Outside, the field lay still, touched by frost in shaded pockets. and the hills beyond were softened, their edges slightly blurred by distance and the chill in the air. A subtle scent of damp earth and distant water hung in the morning, pressing against the schoolhouse with a slow insistence, and the teacher paused, breathing it in, letting it settle. Children arrived in a trickle, small and deliberate, each step careful against the frost-kissed ground. They entered quietly, settling into spaces that seemed to have been waiting for them, the room adjusting naturally to their presence. The teacher did not call them forward, did not direct. He remained at the doorway, observing the room as it accepted them, noting the way the benches creaked under weight. The dust drifted in thin ribbons through shafts of light, and the air carried a steady calm. The sound from the hills returned. It was present but unobtrusive, threading itself through the field, the distant river, the trees. It did not demand attention, yet it drew it, gently, insistent only in its constancy. The teacher did not turn, did not search for it. He let it be, letting it exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the quiet creak of benches and the soft drift of dust motes. The children noticed it, briefly pausing in their work, listening without speaking, then returning to their tasks with the same measured calm. Time passed slowly, unmarked. The sun rose higher, shifting light across benches, floorboards, and walls, tracing long arcs that were ever so slightly different from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees, feeling the rhythm of the day move through him. He did not push, did not guide, did not instruct. He simply observed the shadows that lengthened and shortened, the slight sway of grass beyond the windows, the murmur of river and wind. Each element held its place with quiet sufficiency. No visitors arrived that day. Their absence made no difference. The room had always held its own authority, always taught itself. The teacher felt the reassurance of this settling across his shoulders. The children moved objects on the bench's stones, twigs, scraps of cloth, discovering patterns that emerged only when allowed to form naturally. Their attention was quiet, deliberate, as if the room itself were guiding them without uttering a word. Afternoon deepened, gradually, without sudden announcement. Light shifted imperceptibly. The children paused from time to time, exchanging small glances, their attention oscillating outward and inward, discovering subtle rhythms in the space. The teacher remained seated near the wall, recognizing that presence itself was the lesson. Each motion, each stillness, each inhalation contributing to a pattern larger than instruction or intent. Evening approached. The children gathered their belongings quietly, leaving the room in the same deliberate calm in which they had arrived. Some lingered briefly in the doorway, glancing back at benches, the hearth, the familiar patterns of light on the floor. The teacher remained seated, noticing the faint tremor of the floorboards, the cooling air, the thinning light. The sound from the hills continued, steady, blending seamlessly with the murmur of the river, the sighing of wind, the quiet hum of insects taking up the evening song. He did not rise. He stayed where he was, feeling the subtle weight of shadows stretching across the room, the cool touch of floorboards beneath his feet, the lingering warmth of sunlight in slanted threads. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned, sufficient in itself. The wind shifted outside the field. It carried the faint smell of damp earth, a whisper of early blooms yet to open. The teacher felt it against his skin, in his chest, letting it pass without movement or pursuit. It existed as part of the room, part of the day, part of the rhythm that had long outlasted lessons, schedules, even voice. He remained in the doorway. The children had gone. The room absorbed their absence as it had absorbed their presence. The sound from the hills persisted, indistinguishable now from the murmuring river, the rustling leaves, the distant insect chorus. The teacher breathed slowly, evenly, holding the space between inside and out, between light and shadow, between what had been and what was yet to come. He waited, attentive without expectation, listening without need for comprehension, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time. A thin ribbon of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly. Tracing the slow warmth of the day's passing, the teacher watched, unmoving. As shadows deepened round it, the floorboards creaked faintly, and the air itself seemed to pause, taking a quiet breath before moving again. The sound from the hills carried steadily, threading through the quiet room, over the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. And in that moment, he felt the smallest, most imperceptible change, the kind that drew attention without demanding it, reminding him that the day, and all within it, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end. And he would simply remain, listening. A cool draught brushed the doorway, carrying the faint scent of night. The teacher did not step forward. He did not retreat. He allowed it to flow past him, brushing across the benches, across the floor, across the quiet dust still lingering in the light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps the next. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time in ways subtle and precise, unnoticed yet undeniable. He stayed waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of the fading day, as the light thinned into shadow and the sound of the hills merged with the field and the river. He waited, as he always had. The day broke with a delicate hesitation, the sun rising slowly behind a veil of clouds, softening the edges of the hills into muted shapes. Light slanted through the shutters in narrow, wandering beams, tracing the dust in long, quiet ribbons across benches and floorboards. The teacher lingered in the doorway, hand lightly resting on the worn wood, feeling the faint pulse of the hinges beneath his fingers. Outside, the field lay still, dotted with frost in patches that had lingered overnight, and the river murmured faintly in the distance, indistinguishable from the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. The air carried a faint, earthy scent, cool and damp, settling over the schoolhouse like a subtle presence. Pressing softly against the walls, the children arrived gradually, their steps deliberate, careful not to disturb the quiet that already filled the room. One by one, they moved to the benches, each finding a place that seemed to have been waiting for them all along. The teacher remained at the threshold, saying nothing, calling nothing into being. He simply observed the room as it responded to their arrival, the benches creaking slightly beneath weight, the dust drifting slowly in the angled sunlight, the air itself adjusting round them, carrying their presence gently throughout the space. The sound from the hills returned, soft, persistent, and remarkable in its constancy. It threaded itself through the field and the river, through the swaying trees, reaching the room in thin, persistent waves. It did not demand attention, and yet it claimed it, subtle but insistent. The teacher did not search for its source. He did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the quiet rhythm of floorboards and drifting dust. The children noticed it in slight pauses, tiny shifts in posture, brief upward tilts of the head, before returning to their work with calm, steady attention. Time moved quietly. Almost without notice, the sun rose higher, shifting the patterns of light across benches and floorboards, tracing arcs that were slightly altered from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees, letting the day's rhythm move through him. He did not intervene, did not correct, did not urge. He simply observed the subtle variations of shadow, the gentle sway of the grass beyond the windows, the low murmur of river and wind. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors appeared that day. Their absence made no difference. The room had always held its own authority. Its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt the reassurance of this settle across his shoulders. The children moved objects on the benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth discovering patterns that emerged naturally, requiring no guidance, no correction. Their attention was careful and patient, as if the room itself were teaching them without uttering a word. Afternoon progressed slowly, without announcement. Light shifted imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened and shortened in small increments. The children paused from time to time, exchanging brief glances, moving outward and inward in attention. Discovering rhythms hidden in the subtle space, the teacher remained seated near the wall, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each inhalation contributed to a pattern larger than instruction or intention. Evening began to descend gently. The children gathered their belongings and departed quietly. Some lingered at the doorway, casting glances at benches, the hearth, the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher stayed seated, noting the faint tremor of the floorboards, the cool settling of air, the thinning light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady and unassuming, merging with the murmur of the river, the whispering of wind, and the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He remained in the doorway, feeling the cool brush of shadow against the floor, the faint warmth left in the last strands of sunlight, the subtle pulse of air that filled the empty space. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken and unquestioned. Enough in itself. A faint draught moved through the doorway, carrying the earthy scent of night approaching. The teacher felt it sweep past him, brushing the benches, the floor, the quiet dust still suspended in the fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps in a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time in subtle, precise, almost imperceptible ways, unnoticed yet undeniable. He stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of the fading day, as light thinned into shadow, and the sound of the hills merged with the field and the river. He waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the world would continue to unfold in its quiet, deliberate rhythm, and he would remain quietly present. A final streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the day's passing. Shadows deepened round it. The floorboards creaked faintly, and the air itself seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that subtle shift, the teacher recognized the smallest change, almost invisible, barely perceptible, yet enough to draw full attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end. And he would simply remain, listening, as he had always done. A hush settled over the room. The windows reflected the darkening sky. The floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened in the air. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night. The morning arrived in silence, softer than usual, as if the sun itself hesitated behind the thin clouds that stretched across the pale sky. Light filtered through the shutters in long, narrow stripes, painting the dust in the air and along the benches with quiet, wandering lines. The teacher lingered in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the worn wood, feeling the subtle tremor in the hinges beneath his fingers. Outside, the field lay still, frosted in patches, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The hills beyond were softened by distance, their outlines gentle against the pale sky, while the river murmured faintly, blending with the distant sighing of trees. The air carried the faint promise of movement, a rhythm almost imperceptible, and the teacher paused to feel it. Letting it settle, the children arrived gradually, in twos and threes, their footsteps careful and deliberate. They moved quietly across the frost-kissed ground, entering the room without words, seating themselves in spaces that seemed already shaped for them. The teacher did not call them, did not gesture, did not command. He observed how the room accepted them, noting the gentle creak of benches, the slow drift of dust through the light, the subtle way the air seemed to shift round their presence. The sound from the hills returned. It threaded through the field, the distant river, the trees, faint but persistent. It did not demand attention, yet it held it, filling the quiet with a rhythm that could not be ignored. The teacher did not attempt to locate it, did not name it. He let it exist alongside the children, alongside the shafts of sunlight, alongside the soft creak of benches and the drifting dust. The children noticed it in brief pauses, tiny shifts in posture, small upward glances, before returning to their work with measured calm. Time moved slowly, unmarked. The sun climbed, shifting light across floorboards and benches, tracing arcs slightly different from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting lightly on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day flow through him. He did not direct, did not intervene, did not instruct. He simply observed the subtle shifts of shadow, the sway of grass beyond the windows, the murmur of river and wind. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors arrived that day. Their absence made no difference. The room held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt the reassurance of this settle across his shoulders. The children moved small objects on the benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth, finding patterns that emerged naturally. Without guidance, their attention was careful, patient, deliberate, as if the room itself were teaching them silently. Afternoon deepened gradually. The light shifted imperceptibly, long and thin across benches and floorboards. The children paused now and then, exchanging brief glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering subtle rhythms in the space. The teacher remained seated near the wall, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction or intent. Evening began to settle quietly. The children gathered their belongings, departing without hurry, lingering briefly at the doorway, glancing back at benches, the hearth, the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher stayed seated, noting the faint tremor of floorboards, the settling of air, the thinning light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sighing of wind, the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He remained in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadow along the floor, the faint warmth left in the last threads of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned. Complete, a thin draft moved through the doorway, carrying the scent of night. The teacher felt it sweep past him, brushing benches and floor, drifting over the quiet dust suspended in fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills. The room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet, undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of the fading day, as light thinned into shadow, and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river. He waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A faint streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, carrying the slow warmth of the day's passing. Shadows deepened round it. Floorboards creaked faintly, and the air seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, over the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change. Barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled over the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky, floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night. The morning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the sun itself had decided to linger behind the clouds a little longer. Light slanted through the shutters in thin, wandering lines, tracing the dust in the air, along benches and floorboards, in shapes that shifted slowly with each passing moment. The teacher remained in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the warm wood, feeling the subtle tremor in the hinges, the faint chill that had settled overnight. Outside, the field lay still, patches of frost catching what little warmth the morning offered, while the river murmured faintly in the distance, blending with the whispering of the trees. The air carried the quiet weight of patience, and the teacher breathed it in, letting it settle into his chest. The children arrived in small clusters. Their steps were careful, soft, measured against the frost-kissed ground. They entered the room without words, settling into places that seemed to have waited for them, the room bending gently to their presence. The teacher said nothing. He did not call them forward or gesture. He simply observed the space, noting the way benches accepted their weight, how dust drifted in slow arcs through shafts of light, how the air seemed to hold itself still round them. The sound from the hills returned, faint and steady. It threaded through the field, the river, and the trees beyond. It demanded nothing, and yet it commanded attention by its very constancy. The teacher did not move toward it, did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the slow, deliberate rhythm of floorboards and drifting dust. The children, too, noticed it, brief pauses in their movements, slight upward tilts of the head before returning to their quiet work. Time passed without notice. The sun climbed slowly, shifting light across benches and floorboards in arcs slightly different from yesterday. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting lightly on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day move through him. He did not guide, did not correct, did not interrupt. He simply observed the sway of grass beyond the windows, the murmuring river, the quiet creaks of the benches. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors appeared that day. Their absence was inconsequential. The room had always held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt the reassurance of this settle across his shoulders. The children ranged small objects on the bench's stones, twigs, scraps of cloth, discovering patterns that emerged naturally. Without direction, their attention was careful, deliberate, patient, as if the room itself guided them without speaking. Afternoon deepened gradually. The light shifted imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened and shortened in small increments, tracing slow arcs across benches and floorboards. The children paused occasionally, exchanging glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering hidden rhythms within the space. The teacher remained seated near the wall, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction, larger than intent. Evening settled quietly. The children gathered their belongings and left, moving through the doorway with the same measured calm they had brought to the room. Some lingered briefly at the threshold, glancing back at benches, the hearth, the familiar pots of light across the floor. The teacher remained seated, aware of the faint tremor of floorboards, the settling of cool air, the thinning of light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sighing of wind, and the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He stayed in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadows along the floor, the faint warmth left in the last strands of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned. Complete, a draft shifted across the doorway, carrying the scent of approaching night. The teacher felt it sweep past, brushing benches and floor, drifting over the quiet dust suspended in fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet, undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of fading day. As light thinned into shadow, and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river, he waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measure themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A narrow streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the day's passing. Shadows deepened round it. The floorboards creaked faintly, and the air itself seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change, barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end. And he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled across the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky. Floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night. The morning arrived softly, barely stirring the hills beyond the field. Light filtered through the shutters in narrow, wandering streams, illuminating the dust suspended in the air, along the benches. Across the worn floorboards, the teacher lingered in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the wood, feeling the faint vibration of the hinges, the lingering chill of night that clung stubbornly to the corners outside. The field lay still, frosted in patches where dew had hardened. The river murmuring faintly in the distance, the sound threading through the trees in a quiet, unbroken rhythm. The air carried the subtle weight of patience, pressing gently against the schoolhouse, and the teacher breathed it in, letting it settle into his chest. The children arrived in small, deliberate clusters. Their footsteps were careful, soft, measured. They entered the room without speaking, settling into places that seemed already shaped for them. The room bending gently to their presence. The teacher did not call them forward, did not gesture, did not guide. He simply observed how the space responded, the benches yielding to weight, dust drifting lazily in narrow beams of light, the air itself adjusting to their quiet presence. The sound from the hills returned. It threaded itself through the field, the river, the trees, steady, persistent, and remarkable in its consistency. It did not demand attention, but held it anyway. Subtle and unyielding, the teacher did not seek its source, did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the slow rhythm of creaking floorboards and drifting dust. The children sensed it in brief pauses, slight upward tilts of the head, before returning to their quiet work, patient and deliberate. Time moved slowly, unmeasured. The sun rose, shifting light across benches and floorboards in arcs slightly different from yesterday. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting lightly on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day flow through him. He did not intervene, did not direct, did not correct. He simply observed the sway of grass outside, the murmur of the river, the soft creaks of benches. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors came that day. Their absence was irrelevant. The room held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt reassurance settle across his shoulders. The children moved small objects across benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth forming patterns that emerged naturally. Without guidance, their attention was patient, careful, deliberate, as if the room itself were teaching them without a word. Afternoon deepened gradually. Light shifted imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened and shortened in small increments, tracing slow arcs across benches and floorboards. The children paused now and then, exchanging glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering hidden rhythms within the space. The teacher remained seated, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction or intent. Evening began to settle. The children gathered their belongings and left, moving through the doorway with the same measured calm with which they had arrived. Some lingered, briefly, glancing back at benches, the hearth, the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher remained, aware of the faint tremor of floorboards, the settling cool of air, the thinning light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sighing wind. the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He stayed in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadows along the floor, the faint warmth of the last threads of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken and questioned. Sufficient. A draft shifted through the doorway, carrying the scent of night. The teacher felt it sweep past, brushing benches, floor, the quiet dust still suspended in the fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after. Or perhaps at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills. The room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet, undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of fading day, as light thinned into shadow, and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river. He waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A narrow streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the days passing. Shadows deepened round it, floorboards creaked faintly, and the air seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change, barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled across the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky, floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night. The morning arrived with a hush so delicate it seemed the hills themselves were holding their breath. Light filtered through the shutters in long, wavering lines, illuminating the dust that hung in the air and along the benches, along the worn floorboards, moving slowly as though time itself had slowed to watch. The teacher lingered in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the wood, feeling the faint tremor in the hinges beneath his fingers, the coolness of the air lingering from night outside. The field lay quiet, patches of frost still clinging where the sun had yet to reach, and the river murmured faintly in the distance, threading its sound through the trees. Subtle and unbroken, the scent of damp earth pressed gently against the walls, carrying the quiet patience of the world. The children arrived, one by one, then in small groups. Their footsteps were soft, careful, deliberate, measured against the frost-kissed ground. They entered the room without speaking, settling into spaces that seemed shaped just for them, the room bending gently to their presence. The teacher did not call them forward, did not gesture, did not guide. He simply observed how the space responded, the benches yielding without complaint, the dust drifting slowly in narrow beams of light, the air itself adjusting to the quiet rhythm they carried. The sound from the hills returned. It threaded through the field, the river, the trees beyond, steady and persistent, It did not demand attention, yet it held it. Soft and unyielding, the teacher did not move toward it, did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the slow rhythm of creaking floorboards and drifting dust. The children sensed it in slight pauses, subtle upward tilts of the head, before returning to their quiet work with patient, deliberate care. Time passed slowly, unmarked. Unfolding, as it had always done, the sun climbed higher, shifting light across benches and floorboards in arcs slightly different from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting lightly on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day flow through him. He did not intervene, did not direct, did not correct. He simply observed the sway of grass beyond the windows, the murmuring river, the soft creaks of benches beneath weight. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors came that day. Their absence mattered little. The room held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt a calm reassurance settle across his shoulders. The children moved small objects across benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth forming patterns that emerged naturally, without guidance or correction. Their attention was patient, careful, deliberate, as if the room itself were instructing without uttering a word. Afternoon deepened gradually. The light shifted imperceptibly. Long and narrow across benches and floorboards, shadows lengthened, then shortened, tracing subtle arcs that barely moved with each passing minute. The children paused now and then, exchanging glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering rhythms hidden in the quiet room. The teacher remained seated, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction, larger than intent. Evening settled with a quiet inevitability. The children gathered their belongings and departed, moving through the doorway with the same measured calm with which they had arrived. Some lingered briefly, casting glances back at benches, the hearth, the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher remained seated, aware of the faint tremor of floorboards, the settling cool of the air, the thinning of light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sighing wind, the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He remained in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadows along the floor, the faint warmth left in the last threads of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned. Sufficient. A draft moved across the doorway, carrying the scent of approaching night. The teacher felt it sweep past, brushing benches and floor, drifting over the quiet dust still suspended in fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet, undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of fading day. As light thinned into shadow, and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river, he waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A narrow streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the days passing. Shadows deepened round it. The floorboards creaked faintly, and the air seemed to hold a quiet breath, The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change. Barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled across the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky, floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night. The morning arrived with the gentlest hesitation, the sun lingering behind then, wavering clouds, softening the hills into muted, undulating shapes. Light slanted through the shutters in narrow, wandering beams, scattering across dust and benches, across worn floorboards that had long memorized the tread of feet. The teacher lingered in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the weathered wood, feeling the faint tremor of the hinges and the cool weight of night still clinging to the corners outside. The field lay hushed, frost still catching where sunlight had not yet reached, and the river whispered in the distance, threading its quiet voice through trees and hills alike. The air carried the slow, steady patience of the world, and the teacher inhaled it, letting it settle within him like a soft, persistent rhythm. The children arrived in small, deliberate clusters. Their footsteps were careful, measured, soft against the frost-dusted ground. They entered the room without words, finding spaces that seemed already waiting for them, spaces the room itself had shaped. The teacher did not call them, did not gesture, did not instruct. He observed instead the subtle motion of presence, benches yielding under weight, dust drifting lazily in shafts of light, the air itself adjusting to the quiet rhythm of bodies settling in. The sound from the hills returned. It wound through the field, the river, the trees, constant, unremarkable, and yet insistently present. It demanded no attention, yet held it. The teacher did not search for its origin, did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the gentle creak of floorboards and the drifting dust. The children, too, recognized it in slight pauses, upward glances, or a slow shift of posture, before returning to their quiet work. Deliberate, patient, time unfolded slowly, unmarked. The sun rose, shifting light across benches and floorboards in arcs just slightly different from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees, letting the day's rhythm flow through him. He did not guide, did not correct, did not intervene. He simply observed the sway of grass outside, the murmur of the river, the quiet pulse of wind through trees. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors came that day. Their absence carried no weight. The room had long held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt reassurance settle over him. The children moved small objects across the benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth forming patterns that emerged naturally. Without instruction, their attention was careful, deliberate, patient, as though the room itself guided them without sound. Afternoon deepened gradually. Light shifted imperceptibly, shadows lengthening and shortening in subtle arcs across benches and floorboards. The children paused intermittently, exchanging brief glances, moving outward and inward in attention. Discovering rhythms hidden in the quiet of the space, the teacher remained seated, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction, larger than intention. Evening descended quietly. The children gathered their belongings and departed, moving through the doorway with the same measured calm that had accompanied their arrival. Some lingered briefly, glancing back at benches, at the hearth, at the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher stayed seated, aware of the faint tremor of the floorboards, the settling of cool air, the slow fading of light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sigh of wind, and the soft chorus of evening insects. He did not rise. He remained in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadows, the lingering warmth of the last strands of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned. Sufficient. A draft drifted through the doorway, carrying the faint scent of approaching night. The teacher felt it sweep past, brushing benches and floor, drifting over dust still suspended in the fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet, undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of fading day. As light thinned into shadow and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river, he waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding, aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice, quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A narrow streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the days passing. Shadows deepened, floorboards creaked faintly, and the air seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change. Barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled across the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky, floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed, waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night, and then the morning broke slowly, as if the sun had decided to linger behind a thin veil of clouds, softening the hills into gentle, muted shapes. Light poured through the shutters in long, wandering beams, catching the dust that hung in the air and along the benches, tracing slow patterns across the worn floorboards. The teacher remained in the doorway, hand resting lightly on the wood, feeling the faint tremor of the hinges beneath his fingers, and the cool weight of the night that had yet to leave the corners of the room. Outside, the field lay still, dotted with frost that caught the first faint warmth of the sun. The river whispered quietly in the distance, threading its soft sound through the trees and the bending hills beyond. The air carried a subtle, patient rhythm, pressing gently against the walls, and the teacher inhaled it, letting it settle within him. The children arrived in small clusters, their steps careful, deliberate, measured against the frost-kissed ground. They entered the room without words, seating themselves in spaces that seemed already waiting for them. The teacher did not call, did not gesture, did not instruct. He observed the room's quiet acknowledgement of their presence, the benches yielding under weight, dust drifting lazily in beams of light, the air itself adjusting to the rhythm they carried. The sound from the hills returned. It wound its way through the field, through the trees, along the river's edge, constant, unremarkable, yet insistently present. It demanded nothing, yet claimed attention. The teacher did not seek its source, did not attempt to name it. He allowed it to exist alongside the children, alongside the light, alongside the slow, deliberate creaks of floorboards and drifting dust. The children noticed it in brief pauses, slight upward tilts of the head, before returning to their quiet work. Patient and deliberate, time moved slowly, unmeasured, unmarked. The sun climbed, shifting light across benches and floorboards in arcs slightly different from the day before. The teacher leaned against the wall, hands resting loosely on his knees, letting the rhythm of the day flow through him. He did not intervene, did not guide, did not correct. He simply observed the sway of grass outside, the murmur of the river, the quiet pulse of wind through the trees. Each element held its place, measured only by its own presence. No visitors appeared that day. Their absence made no difference. The room had long held its own authority, its own quiet lessons. The teacher felt a calm reassurance settle across his shoulders. The children moved small objects across benches, stones, twigs, scraps of cloth forming patterns that emerged naturally. Without guidance, their attention was careful, deliberate, patient, as if the room itself guided them without speaking. Afternoon deepened gradually. Light shifted imperceptibly. Shadows lengthened and shortened in subtle arcs across benches and floorboards. The children paused now and then, exchanging brief glances, moving outward and inward in attention, discovering rhythms hidden within the quiet room. The teacher remained seated, recognizing that presence itself had become the lesson. Each motion, each pause, each breath contributed to a pattern larger than instruction, larger than intent. Evening descended quietly. The children gathered their belongings and departed, moving through the doorway with the same measured calm that had accompanied their arrival. Some lingered briefly, casting glances back at benches, the hearth, the familiar trails of light across the floor. The teacher remained, aware of the faint tremor of floorboards, the settling cool of air, the slow fading of light. The sound from the hills persisted, steady, blending with the river, the sighing of wind, the soft chorus of insects beginning their evening song. He did not rise. He remained in the doorway, feeling the subtle coolness of shadows along the floor, the faint warmth of the last strands of sunlight, the slow pulse of air around him. Presence had become the measure of the day, unspoken, unquestioned. Sufficient. A draft moved through the doorway, carrying the faint scent of approaching night. The teacher felt it sweep past, brushing benches and floor, drifting over the quiet dust still suspended in fading light. The children would return tomorrow, or the day after, or perhaps at a time he could not measure. The wind, the river, the hills, the room itself, these would continue to mark the passage of time subtly, precisely, imperceptibly. Yet undeniably, he stayed, waiting, listening, poised between the absence of night and the presence of fading day. As light thinned into shadow and the sound of the hills merged with the field and river, he waited, as he always had, attentive without expectation, listening without need for understanding. Aware that the next subtle shift, the one that would arrive unannounced, would reveal itself in its own time, and he would notice. Quietly, as he always had, between presence and absence, attentive to the patient rhythm of days that measured themselves not by counting, but by the unfolding of what was already there. A narrow streak of light lingered along the far wall. It moved imperceptibly, tracing the slow warmth of the days passing. Shadows deepened, floorboards creaked faintly, and the air seemed to hold a quiet breath. The sound from the hills threaded steadily through the room, across the bending field, toward the darkening hills beyond. In that moment, the teacher recognized the smallest change. Barely perceptible, almost invisible, yet enough to draw attention, reminding him that the day, and all it contained, would continue to unfold without hurry, without instruction, without end, and he would simply remain, listening. A hush settled across the room. Windows reflected the darkening sky, floorboards absorbed the last traces of light, and the faint scent of night deepened. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorframe, hands resting on its edges, aware of the stillness, aware of the patience of the world outside, aware that he had done nothing except wait, observe, and listen, and that was enough. He stayed waiting, listening, breathing, as the hills, the river, the field, and the quiet room continued their patient rhythm, carrying the day into night, and then the first chill of night began to creep along the edges of the room, slipping under the shutters, tracing the corners with quiet insistence. The last streaks of sunlight lingered faintly, stretched thin over benches and floorboards, painting the dust in long, drifting lines. The teacher leaned lightly against the doorway, hands resting on its edges, feeling the slight tremor of the wood beneath him, the soft pulse of air moving slowly through the room, outside. The field had darkened, the frost glimmering briefly before melting into shadow. The river murmured steadily in the distance, threading its gentle voice through the trees, over the hills, carrying the hush of evening with it. The children had gone, but the room still held them in traces, the faint scent of wool and earth, the subtle shift in air where they had moved, the quiet weight of benches pressed down by little bodies. He did not move toward the empty spaces. He did not attempt to fill them. Presence, he realized, did not vanish simply because the ones who carried it had left. It lingered, just as the light lingered, just as the sound of the hills lingered, weaving itself into the day that had passed. A faint wind came through the open window, brushing the floorboards, stirring dust into slow, suspended arcs. The teacher noticed the way it carried the distant smell of frost and river, of the damp earth beyond the field. He did not name it. He did not speak. He simply inhaled it, letting it trace the quiet path of the day behind him. Time seemed to stretch differently at this hour. The hills softened in the darkening distance, losing their sharp outlines, folding into one another in muted waves. The river's murmur became more insistent, not louder, not sudden, but constant, threading through the field, past the edge of the trees and into the silence of the room. Shadows shifted slowly across benches, across floorboards, until they merged with the dim outlines of objects left behind. Even the dust, caught in the last threads of light, seemed to drift in deliberate arcs, waiting, unhurried. He stayed in the doorway. His hands rested lightly on the edges, his feet planted firmly on the floor. He did not speak, did not move toward the shadows, did not chase the drifting dust. He listened, the wind in the trees, the murmuring river, the distant hills, the quiet settling of the day into night, each sound threaded into the other, weaving a fabric of stillness that held him, and held the space perfectly. Without interference, a narrow beam of moonlight appeared. Slipping between the shutters, it traced a path across the floorboards, cutting through shadow with slow precision. He watched it move, minute by minute, aware of how it shifted imperceptibly as the night deepened. The room breathed with the rhythm of the earth, the sky, the hills beyond. The sound from the river threaded through the moonlight, through the still air, carrying a quiet reminder that even in absence, the world persisted, measured not by human action, but by the slow unfolding of itself. The air grew colder. The teacher felt it press against his hands, against his face, seeping beneath the hem of his coat. Yet he did not move. He remained, aware of the subtle shifts in temperature, in light. In the very atmosphere around him, the quiet of the evening did not demand attention. It invited. It gently, insistently, without hurry. Somewhere, a tree shifted, its branches brushing one another in a soft, dry murmur. The sound threaded across the field, over the river, into the darkening hills. Before threading back into the room, it was neither loud nor sudden. Yet it drew the attention fully, folding itself into the rhythm of the space. The teacher noticed, without comment, without reflection, simply noting the presence of this sound, as he noted the bending of light, the subtle tremor of floorboards, the lingering trace of the children. He stayed, listening, waiting, feeling the slow pulse of the world beyond the walls, of the room itself, of the day now folded entirely into night. Presence had become enough. The faint motion of dust, the shifting of shadows, the subtle rhythm of air and river and hill, these marked time without numbers, without calendars, without urgency. And yet, even in the quiet, a small change was coming. A leaf fell outside, carried by the wind, brushing against the frost on the field. Its motion was brief, almost invisible, but it shifted the air around it, shifted the sound, shifted the space. The teacher's hand moved slightly, pressing against the doorway, fingers brushing lightly over the wood, as if to acknowledge the imperceptible, inevitable unfolding of what came next. He remained still, watching the last light fade, the shadows deepen, the sound from the hill steady and patient, carrying the night slowly forward, and noticing the night deepened slowly, folding over the hills, the field, the river, until the outlines of trees and benches became soft, indefinite shapes. The moonlight moved across the room in narrow streaks, shifting imperceptibly with every subtle motion of the sky, tracing the floorboards and the faint trail of dust caught in its path. The teacher stayed in the doorway, hands resting lightly on the wood, sensing the slight tremor of the hinges, the cool weight of night pressing against the walls. Outside, the river whispered quietly, threading through the darkened field, through the trees, carrying the hush of evening into the room. The air was still, except for the faint stirring of leaves and the subtle vibration of the earth beneath the hills. The faintest sound of movement came from the forest beyond. A branch shifted, or perhaps a small animal, moving in a rhythm neither abrupt nor sudden, but deliberate. The teacher did not search for it, did not name it. He simply observed, aware that each subtle motion belonged to the same unbroken measure of time that the hills and river, the field and the quiet room, had been keeping all day. The stillness of the room seemed to respond, bending gently round the smallest changes, accommodating them without notice. The children's absence left traces. The benches bore the slight impressions of small bodies. Dust was disturbed in delicate arcs where hands had rested or objects had moved. A scrap of cloth lay folded. A stone balanced on a windowsill. The teacher did not move them. He did not replace them. Their presence remained, a silent testament to the day that had passed. He breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the rhythm of observation and attention carry him. Time continued. Unmeasured, the moon traced its slow path across the sky, and with it the streaks of light shifted, touching corners and surfaces in new ways. Shadows lengthened and shortened imperceptibly, following arcs that could not be counted. The river's murmur persisted, steady, threading through the field, the trees, the hills, and finally into the quiet of the room. Even the faintest stirring of wind across the hill seemed purposeful, deliberate, adding to the invisible tapestry of time that the teacher witnessed without comment, without interruption. Simply noting its presence, a chill brushed the doorway. The air moved lightly over the floorboards, stirring dust in gentle, suspended arcs. The teacher felt the faint temperature shift, the slight pressure of the wind on his skin, but did not move. He remained still, letting the subtle pulse of air and night carry forward round him, blending with the muted chorus of insects, the faint rustling of leaves, the distant murmur of the river. Each sound, each motion, each pause became part of the same careful and read rhythm, marking the passage of the night without any need for accounting or measuring. A faint reflection appeared on the wall. Moonlight struck a pane at an oblique angle, casting a narrow streak that moved imperceptibly as the clouds shifted overhead. The teacher's eyes followed it, noting its path, tracing the subtle variations as shadows deepened round it. Even the smallest motions held weight, significance, a kind of quiet authority that needed no explanation. Each detail folded into the next, forming the silent, persistent pattern of the world in motion, the world moving without urgency, without insistence, carrying the night forward. He stayed, hands lightly pressed against the doorway, feet planted firmly on the floor, attentive to the faintest motion, the smallest sound, the gentle rhythms that pass beyond human notice. The night had no need of hurry. It moved at its own pace, carrying light, shadow, wind, river, and hills in slow, deliberate arcs. Each breath of air, each faint movement of dust, each subtle creak of the floorboards became a marker of time in a system without numbers, without calendars. Without need for acknowledgement beyond attention, a small motion arrived. A leaf, caught in the wind, drifted across the frost of the field outside, brushing against the edge of a branch, stirring the air slightly, brushing the faint sheen of frost on the grass. Its path was brief, almost invisible, yet it shifted the sound, shifted the air, shifted the room in a way that could not be ignored. The teacher felt the motion subtly pressing a little more firmly against the doorway, fingers brushing the wood in acknowledgement, in recognition of the continuation of movement, of the unbroken pattern that carried day into night, now night into deeper night. He remained, watching the last faint streaks of moonlight, feeling the slow deepening of shadow, listening to the river, the wind, the hills, the quiet stirring of the night, aware that each subtle shift was part of the same persistent rhythm, unbroken, unmeasured, inevitable. And as the faint light continued its imperceptible travel across floorboards, as shadows deepened, as dust hung in the air, and as the sound of the hills threaded steadily through the room, he noticed the room grew darker still, folded into the slow rhythm of night. The moon had climbed higher, yet its light fell in narrow, shifting streams through the shutters, touching floorboards, benches, and dust in arcs that changed imperceptibly. The teacher remained in the doorway, hands resting lightly on the wood, feeling the subtle tremor of the hinges, the slow pulse of the air around him. Outside, the field lay hushed, frost glimmering faintly before dissolving into shadow, the river murmuring steadily in the distance, threading its quiet voice through trees and hills alike. The night held itself without hurry, without insistence, carrying a rhythm older than memory. A rhythm that needed no witness, but had one nonetheless. A small sound stirred in the distance. The faint scraping of a branch, the whisper of an animal, something shifting along the edge of the field. The teacher did not search for it, did not name it, did not attempt to measure it. He simply acknowledged its presence, letting it thread into the quiet pattern that already filled the room. Each subtle motion outside the drifting wind, the river's murmur, the shifting shadows folded into the same gentle cadence of the night, unbroken, unmeasured, inevitable. The children's absence was tangible, their places on the benches, the small impressions of their hands on dust. The faint scent of wool and earth all lingered in quiet testimony of the day that had passed. The teacher did not move them. He did not rearrange them. He allowed their presence to remain in traces, a silent rhythm to match the slow unfolding of night. He inhaled deeply, aware of each subtle sound and movement. Letting the calm of observation carry him forward, time itself seemed to bend. The moonlight shifted imperceptibly, stretching across floorboards and benches, weaving in and out of shadow, tracing paths that could not be counted. The river's murmur threaded steadily through the field, through trees, over hills, threading its quiet voice into the room itself. Even the faint stirring of wind over the hills seemed deliberate, measured, part of the slow, persistent unfolding of the night. The teacher observed all of it, noting its passage, yet making no claim upon it. Presence alone was sufficient. A chill brushed the doorway. The air pressed against floorboards, stirring dust in slow, suspended arcs. The teacher felt it lightly on his skin, but did not move. He remained still, letting the subtle pulse of air, of night, of the hills, carry through him and the room alike. The quiet of evening invited attention without demanding it, carrying rhythm, carrying weight, carrying itself. A slender reflection appeared along the wall. Moonlight struck a pane at an oblique angle, casting a narrow streak that shifted imperceptibly as clouds moved overhead. The teacher's eyes followed it, noting its path, tracing its slow, deliberate progress as shadows deepened round it. Even the smallest motions held meaning, authority, weight without words. Each detail folded into the next, forming the silent, persistent pattern of the world. Moving without haste, moving without interruption, moving unbroken, he stayed. Hands pressed lightly against the doorway, feet planted on the floor, listening to the faintest movement, the smallest sound, the subtle rhythm threading through air, river, and hills. Night required no hurry. It moved at its own pace, carrying light, shadow, wind, river, and hills in arcs slow and deliberate. Each breath of air, each subtle motion of dust, each faint creak of floorboards became a measure of time in a system without numbers, without calendars, without claim beyond attention. A small motion writhed, a single leaf, carried by the wind, drifted across frost in the field outside, brushing against a branch, stirring air and sound, shifting the faint sheen of frost. Its motion was brief, almost invisible, yet it altered the pattern of the night in a way that could not be ignored. The teacher felt the subtle disturbance, pressing lightly against the doorway, fingers brushing the wooden, quiet acknowledgement of the continuation of movement, of the unbroken rhythm carrying day into night, night into deeper night. He remained, watching the streaks of moonlight, sensing the deepening shadows, listening to the river, the wind, the hills, the soft stirring of the night. Every subtle shift was part of the same persistent and broken rhythm, carrying the world forward without instruction, without hurry, without demand. And as the faint light travelled across floorboards, as dust hung in the air, as the hills murmured steadily beyond the window, he noticed A whisper of motion in the corner of the room, so slight it might have been imagined, yet it moved the air enough to brush against the floor, and the teacher, still pressed to the doorway, fell to tracing it, following it, waiting to see. A faint, almost imperceptible movement stirred in the corner of the room. The teacher's eyes, steady and unhurried, traced the shift in shadow, noting how it bent and flickered along the floorboards. It was so slight it might have been imagined. A subtle stirring of air or dust, a trace of the night's rhythm manifesting in miniature. He did not reach toward it. He did not name it. He simply observed, aware that even the smallest disturbance carried the same weight as the river's murmur or the wind brushing over the hills. Outside, the field was nearly invisible in the dark, the frost fading into shadow. The river continued its steady murmur, threading past trees and over hills, carrying the persistent cadence of time through night, through space, through the quiet room. The air held a chill now, settling along the teacher's shoulders and hands, pressing softly into the corners of the room. Each sound, each motion, each subtle change felt deliberate, measured, yet entirely without urgency. He remained pressed to the doorway, hands resting lightly on the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor, his attention extended outward and inward at once. Shadows stretched across benches and floorboards, bending and merging in imperceptible arcs. Dust drifted lazily in narrow beams of moonlight. Tiny particles reflecting fragments of silver as they hovered, the quiet of the night seemed alive, moving with a rhythm entirely its own, carrying its own story, unfolding in arcs the eye could follow only slowly, patiently. The faint leaf outside shifted again, brushing the frost, stirring a whisper of sound. It moved in an arc too small to track without careful attention, yet enough to ripple through the space. Threading its presence into the room, the teacher noticed. He did not move. He simply allowed the recognition to settle like the air itself, a quiet acknowledgement of continuity, of the persistent unfolding of the world, of the day folded into night, and the night continuing in its patient and hurried course. A soft wind entered through the shutters. It stirred the dust along the floor, carrying with it a subtle scent of river and frost, of soil and distant hills. The teacher inhaled it slowly, deliberately, allowing it to fill the space between himself and the room. Even in the stillness, there was motion, and even in the darkness, there was a measure of light. Carried in the moon's shifting streaks across floor and wall, presence and absence coexisted. Interwoven seamlessly, the sound from the hills persisted. Its thread wound across the field, through the trees, over the river, and into the quiet room, constant, steady, unbroken. The teacher felt it in the vibration of the floor beneath him, in the faint trembling of the air, in the subtle pulse of the night itself. He did not speak, he did not stir. He simply allowed the sound to exist alongside every other measure of the evening, the shifting shadows, the drifting dust, the faint motion of the corner, the leaf outside. Time, uncounted and unmarked, continued its quiet passage, each minute stretched into the next, unfolding without ceremony. The moonlight shifted, moving imperceptibly along floorboards, tracing the small impressions left by children long gone. The teacher observed the faint course, the slight bends in dust where hands had rested, where stones had balanced. Each trace was a marker, a quiet measure of what had passed. Sufficient without commentary, sufficient without claim. A small, fleeting motion drew his attention. Something shifted against the far wall dust, perhaps, or the gentle sway of shadow. It was momentary, almost invisible, yet enough to draw notice. The teacher did not move toward it. He did not question it. He allowed it to exist, recognizing it as part of the same rhythm that had carried day into night, that would carry night forward into the faint and measured morning beyond. He stayed, listening, waiting, watching, feeling the slow pulse of moonlight, shadow, wind, river, and hills, every subtle shift, every minute motion, threaded into the same patient rhythm. A pattern unfolding without demand, without counting, without need for understanding. Presence alone measured time, and he was present, steady, attentive, aligned with the quiet persistence of the world. And then, in the stillest moment of the night, the air itself seemed to pause. Even the river softened in its murmur, the wind in the trees slackened. The moonlight hung in its narrow streaks across the benches and floorboards. Steady yet delicate, the dust floated in arcs almost too slow to perceive. And somewhere, just at the edge of sight, the faint shadow in the corner shifted again, following a rhythm he could not name, but one he recognized, and he waited quietly for the motion to continue, for the night to carry it onward, for the world to unfold. The corner remained quiet for a long moment, yet the shadow shifted again, subtle and deliberate, brushing along the floorboards in a path almost too slight to notice. The teacher's hands stayed lightly on the doorway, fingers grazing the wood, as if anchoring himself to the room, while observing the faint movements that carried on round him. The air was still, yet it trembled with the hushed pulse of the night wind brushing the trees, river murmuring, distant hills settling into the dark, each sound threaded through the other, forming a rhythm that was not measured, not counted, but undeniably present. The moonlight moved imperceptibly. Narrow streaks traced across floorboards, across benches, across the traces left by small hands and feet. Catching faint arcs of dust suspended in the air, the teacher noticed the delicate patterns. Letting his gaze linger without interruption, without thought beyond observation. Presence was its own instruction. Time measured itself here not in hours or minutes, but in small arcs of light, in the drifting of dust, in the faint strings that whispered against walls and windows and floorboards alike. Outside, the field and the river were nearly invisible in the darkness. Yet the sound of the water persisted, threading past trees, over hills, into the quiet room. The wind moved through branches with a subtle insistence, pressing its soft rhythm into every corner. The teacher listened to it all with patient attention, letting the motion settle into his awareness without comment. Without interference, the night moved steadily onward, unhurried, carrying everything forward without need for notice, without demand for understanding. A faint motion caught his eye again. Something near the far bench, a tiny shift of shadow. A subtle string of dust followed a quiet, deliberate path. The teacher's eyes tracked it. His body unmoving, his hands resting lightly on the doorway. He did not reach toward it. He did not name it. He simply noted its place in the pattern of the night, in the rhythm that threaded the river, the field, the hills, the faint movements within the room itself. The chill deepened. The air pressed lightly against his skin, brushing the dust in gentle arcs, carrying the faint scent of earth and river, of frost and distant soil. He inhaled it slowly, deliberately, feeling it thread through him as it threaded through the room, letting it settle into the quiet rhythm of presence he had held all day and would hold again tomorrow. Shadows bent slowly across the floorboards, deepening round the streaks of moonlight, moving imperceptibly, tracing subtle arcs that echoed the faint patterns left by the children. Time continued, unmarked, uncounted. Every breath, every motion, every subtle shift of dust or shadow contributed to a rhythm older than memory, a rhythm that did not require numbers, calendars, or attention beyond awareness. The leaf outside shifted again, brushing the frost, stirring the air, moving in a deliberate, almost invisible lock. Its motion was brief, yet it altered the night's rhythm enough to ripple through the room, threading itself into the same persistent pulse that carried the river, the wind, the hills. The teacher felt it in the air, in the floorboards beneath him, in the quiet and broken measure of the world round him. He remained pressed to the doorway, hands lightly on the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor. He followed the subtle motions with his attention, letting them thread through him, through the space, through the night. Even the faintest strings, the drifting dust, the moving leaf, the shifting shadow were part of the same pattern, carrying night forward, carrying time forward, carrying presence forward, and broken, unhurried, inevitable, and then a whisper of motion so slight it could almost have been imagined moved along the floor near the far wall. The teacher noticed it, following its slow, deliberate path, tracing it with his eyes, feeling the pulse of its motion in the quiet air. The shadows deepened. The moonlight held its streak across the floor. The river murmured softly. The wind brushed the hills, and he remained, still and observant, following the smallest shift, waiting for what would unfold next as the night carried on. A faint motion lingered near the far wall, barely enough to disturb the shadows. The teacher's eyes traced it without moving his body, hands resting lightly on the doorway as though the wood itself could anchor him to the quiet pulse of the room. Moonlight stretched in narrow streaks across floorboards and benches, drifting dust caught in its path, moving slowly as if time had decided to stretch itself along with the light outside. The field was a soft blur of darkness, the river murmuring in its steady, unhurried rhythm, threading past trees and over hills, threading into the stillness of the room. The air shifted. A subtle draught came through the shutters, pressing against the floor and the teacher's shoulders, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and frost. The wind brushed against distant branches, rustling them in slow, careful arcs that the night seemed to magnify. The teacher did not stir, did not speak, did not attempt to name any sound. He simply noticed, allowing the faint patterns to settle into awareness, the whisper of the hills, the gentle pulse of the river, the faint stirring in the corner of the room. The shadow shifted again. Something moved, dust perhaps, or the faint sway of a forgotten object tracing a path so slight it might have been imagined. He followed it with quiet attention, feeling its subtle motion connect to the broader rhythm of the night. Moonlight stretching, air moving, river murmuring, leaves brushing one another. Each motion belonged equally. Each contributed to the persistent, patient cadence that held the room in stillness, the world in presence. Time continued and counted. The moonlight moved imperceptibly, casting long, bending lines across benches and floorboards. The children's faint traces remained, as light depression where a hand had rested, a dusted arc of movement, a stone left on the sill. These were all parts of the same unfolding pattern. The teacher's gaze followed them without pause, and in doing so, he became part of the rhythm himself, presence measuring time where numbers had long failed. Outside, a leaf drifted. It brushed the frost lightly, turning in the wind's invisible current. So slight a motion that it barely disturbed the air. Yet it moved the shadows, stirred dust, and threaded the night with a gentle ripple. The teacher felt it as he had felt so many imperceptible motions before, connected, small, significant, and entirely natural. He did not reach to catch it, did not attempt to measure it. He simply observed, allowing the rhythm of world, night, and room to continue unbroken. He stayed, hands lightly on the doorway, feet planted on the floor, eyes tracing every subtle arc of moonlight, every drifting particle of dust, every faint stir of shadow. Presence alone measured time here. No counting, no calendars, no clocks, only attention and quiet observation. The hills, the river, the wind, the faint sounds in the room. and the smallest motions of dust and leafall spoke a language of persistence, of continuity, of the patient passage of night. And then, in the corner, the shadow moved once more. It was tiny, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. The teacher's gaze held it steady, following the faint stir across the floor, feeling the pull of it in the quiet air. Moonlight, shadows, wind, river, and hills all threaded together in the patient cadence of the night. He remained, pressed lightly to the doorway, listening, waiting, watching. The night unfolded slowly, carrying everything forward, carrying each small motion, each faint sound, each whisper of presence into what would come next. The shadow lingered a moment longer, then shifted again, so faintly that it seemed part of the darkness itself. The teacher's eyes followed without blinking, tracing the slow, deliberate arc it made across the floorboards. Dust drifted in the narrow streaks of moonlight, moving lazily as if suspended in a world without hurry. The river murmured in the distance, threading past the trees, past the hills, carrying a rhythm older than anyone in the village could name. The wind brushed the field softly, bending the frost, rustling the edges of the trees, whispering faint patterns that the night held without explanation. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers brushing the wood, feet steady on the floor. He inhaled slowly, feeling the chill of the night carry the faint scent of earth, frost, and water. Each sound, each subtle motion, threaded itself into the quiet cadence of the world round him, and he allowed it to exist fully without comment or interference. Even the smallest stirrings, the drifting dust, the leaf outside, the shifting shadow were part of the same unbroken rhythm, each carrying the night forward. The moonlight moved imperceptibly. It traced the floorboards in long, slender lines, stretching across benches and the faint impressions left by children, touching the dust where their hands had rested. Shadows bent and shifted, merging and separating as the streaks of light slowly changed angle, weaving the room into a delicate tapestry of motion and stillness outside. The hills were dark shapes against the sky, the river a thin thread of sound threading through the distant trees. A faint sigh stirred the room. The teacher felt it brush against his shoulders, against the floor, carrying the faintest motion in the dust and the shadow in the corner. He followed it with his attention, tracing the small arc of movement without reaching, without touching, without naming it. Presence itself was enough. The night slow, patient rhythm required nothing else. Each sound, each motion, each pause folded into the next seamlessly, carrying time forward in the quietest way. He stayed, watching, listening, feeling the pulse of the world unfold. Moonlight, shadows, river, wind, dust, hills, each thread wove itself into the same pattern, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Even the smallest motion, like the faint leaf drifting outside, was part of a rhythm far larger than any counting, any clock, any measure could capture. Time existed here only in attention, only in presence, only in the quiet awareness of what was already happening. And then the shadow in the corner moved once more, slight, deliberate, carrying the same rhythm as the river, as the hills, as the drifting dust. The teacher's eyes followed it carefully, his hands pressed lightly to the doorway, his body unmoving. Fully present, the moonlight streaked across the floorboards, the river whispered in the distance. The wind brushed the field, and the night continued to unfold, patient and unbroken, carrying each motion, each sound, each subtle shift forward. The shadow lingered a heartbeat, then shifted again, so slight it could have been mistaken for a trick of the moonlight. The teacher's eyes traced its motion, following the faint curve across floorboards worn smooth by years of small movements. Dust swirled in narrow arcs, suspended in the silver light, catching fragments of the night as it drifted lazily. Outside, the river murmured steadily, threading past trees and hills. Its cadence unhurried, patient, precise. The wind brushed the field softly, bending frost and grasses with a careful rhythm that the room absorbed quietly, letting it fold into its own stillness. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor. He breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the cool air fill the space round him, carrying faint scents of earth, river, and distant hills, every sound, every subtle motion threaded into the quiet rhythm of the night. And he received it fully without comment, without interruption. Even the smallest stirrings, the leaf drifting outside, the shadow in the corner, the tiny arcs of dust belonged equally to the unfolding night. Time passed without counting. Moonlight shifted imperceptibly across the floorboards, tracing long lines across benches and the faint impressions left by children's hands. Shadows bent and merged, separating again in slow, delicate arcs. The hills became darker shapes. The trees still whispered with the wind, and the river's soft voice threaded steadily through the night. The teacher noticed all of it, allowing the movements to settle into awareness. The stillness of observation, measuring time where clocks and numbers could not, a faint, deliberate sigh of air moved through the room. It brushed floor and walls, stirring dust in lazy arcs and brushing the shadow in the corner. The teacher's attention followed it, holding it gently, without reaching, without naming it. Presence alone was enough to mark the rhythm of the night. Every sound, every pause, every subtle shift contributed to the same patient cadence, carrying the darkness forward, threading the room, the field, the hills, the river, into one continuous motion. He stayed, watching, listening, sensing the pulse of the night unfold. Moonlight, shadows, dust, wind, river, hills, all threads in the same quiet pattern, slow, deliberate, unbroken. Even the smallest motions, like the leaf drifting outside, were part of the rhythm, each carrying the night forward without hurry or insistence. Time existed here only in attention, only in presence, only in the quiet recognition of what already was. And then the shadow in the corner moved again, slight, deliberate, threading the same rhythm as river, hills, and drifting dust. The teacher's gaze held it steady, following the subtle shift across the floor, tracing its slow path with full awareness. Moonlight streaked across floorboards. The river murmured faintly. The wind brushed the field, and the night continued its patient, unbroken unfolding, carrying every motion, every whisper of presence forward. The shadow shifted once more, almost too faint to see, and yet the teacher's eyes held it in quiet attention. The moonlight lay in narrow streaks across the floorboards, stretching over benches, across the faint arcs of dust, touching the slight depressions left by small hands and feet. The river murmured steadily outside, threading past the trees and over the hills, its voice persistent, unhurried, carrying a rhythm older than memory. The wind brushed through the field softly, bending the frost and grasses, threading its sound into the room, letting the night move forward in its own deliberate pace. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers brushing the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor, breath slow, steady, synchronized with the subtle pulse of the night, the wind, the river, the moonlight, the faint strings of dust and shadow. Each motion, each sound, each pause belonged to the same quiet cadence, part of the persistent, patient rhythm that carried night forward. Presence alone was enough, measuring time where numbers and clocks had long failed. Outside, a leaf drifted. It brushed the frost lightly, turning on an invisible current. A tiny ripple that moved the air, brushed the dust, shifted the shadows just slightly. The teacher noticed it without reaching or naming it, allowing the motion to exist as part of the same unbroken pattern that threaded moonlight. River, hills, wind, and shadows, every subtle shift, every whisper of motion, folded seamlessly into the quiet, deliberate passage of the night. He stayed, watching, listening, feeling the slow unfolding of the world. Moonlight, dust, shadows, wind, river, hills, all threads in a single, unhurried rhythm. Even the smallest stirrings were important, each carrying the night forward. Time existed here only in attention, only in presence, only in the recognition of what already was, and then, in the corner, the shadow moved again, deliberate, slow, almost imperceptible, yet alive with the same rhythm as river and wind, hills and moonlight. The teacher's gaze followed it carefully, hands lightly on the doorway, body still. Fully present, the moonlight stretched across the floor, shadows shifted, dust drifted. River murmured, and the night carried on. The shadow lingered, then shifted again, so faint it could have been imagined. The teacher's eyes traced its movement across the floorboards, following its slow, deliberate arc as dust swirled in the thin streaks of moonlight outside. The river murmured steadily, threading past the trees and over the hills, its rhythm unhurried, constant, ancient. The wind brushed through the field, bending the frost and grasses in quiet arcs, threading its own subtle motion into the room. Everything moved together yet separately, a slow, patient cadence that the teacher received fully without interruption or need for words. He remained pressed to the doorway, hands resting lightly on the wood, fingers grazing its grain, feet planted firmly on the floor. His breath matched the slow rhythm of the night, in and out, unhurried, deliberate, attentive, each sound, each motion, the river, the wind, the hills, the leaf drifting outside. The faint, shifting shadow folded into the same quiet pattern, carrying night forward without numbers, without clocks, without any measure beyond presence itself. The moonlight shifted imperceptibly. Narrow streaks stretched across floorboards, benches, and the faint impressions left by children, bending and merging in slow arcs with the shadows. The hills were soft. Dark shapes beyond the field. The river whispered through the trees, steady and persistent. The wind pressed gently, carrying a faint chill that settled along the teacher's shoulders and hands. All of it threaded together into the patient, unbroken rhythm of night, a cadence older than memory, yet entirely immediate in its quiet insistence. Then the faint stir in the corner moved once more, so small it could almost have been imagined, yet deliberate, following the same rhythm as the river, hills, drifting dust. The teacher's eyes held it steady, following its path across the floor, tracing its slow, careful motion. Moonlight streaked across the boards, shadows deepened and stretched. Dust swirled in silent arcs, river murmured faintly. Wind brushed the trees and field. The night carried all these motions forward, patient, unbroken, allowing each to exist fully within the quiet rhythm of the world. The shadow moved again, almost imperceptibly, brushing along the floorboards as if carried by the night itself. The teacher's eyes held it, steady, unhurried, following the faint, deliberate path it traced. Moonlight stretched across benches and the floor, tracing arcs of dust and the faint impressions left by small hands and feet. Outside, the river murmured softly, threading past trees, over hills, carrying its slow, constant rhythm. The wind brushed across the field, bending frost and grasses in gentle curves, threading the quiet pulse of the world into the room. Every movement, every sound, every subtle shift was part of the same unbroken cadence. A rhythm older than memory. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor, breath slow and deliberate, synchronized with the subtle pulse of the night, the wind. The river, the drifting shadows. The leaf moving outside, presence alone marked the passage of time here. In a system without numbers, clocks, or calendars. The night itself measured time, and the teacher received it fully, silently, patiently. Moonlight shifted imperceptibly. It stretched across floorboards, benches, and the faint arcs of dust, bending shadows in long, slow lines. The hills became darker shapes beyond the field. The river's voice threaded steadily through the trees. The wind whispered against branches, carrying subtle arcs of motion into the room. The teacher's gaze followed them all, allowing each movement to exist, to continue, to persist without interruption or judgment. Even the smallest motions, the leaf, the dust, the corner shadow, were significant in the patient cadence of the night. He stayed, watching, listening, feeling the slow unfolding of the world. Moonlight, dust, shadows, wind, river, hills, all threads in a single. Unhurried rhythm, even the smallest stirrings were important, each carrying the night forward. Time existed only in attention, in presence, in the quiet acknowledgement of what already was, and the shadow in the corner moved once more, deliberate, subtle, threading the same rhythm as river. Wind, hills, drifting dust. The teacher's gaze followed it carefully. Hands lightly on the doorway, body still, fully present. Moonlight streaked across floorboards, shadows deepened. Dust swirled lazily, river murmured softly, and the night carried on, patient, unbroken, letting each motion, each sound, each whisper of presence continue. The shadow lingered a moment longer, then shifted again, so slight it might have been imagined. Yet it carried its own quiet weight. The teacher's eyes followed it steadily, tracing the slow, deliberate curve across the floorboards. Moonlight streamed through the shutters in narrow streaks, touching benches, dust, and the faint impressions of small hands and feet, casting long, delicate shadows. Outside, the river murmured with its steady, patient rhythm, threading past trees and over hills, carrying a cadence older than memory. The wind brushed the field, bending frost and grasses in soft, deliberate arcs, its subtle motion weaving into the quiet rhythm of the room. He remained pressed to the doorway, hands resting lightly on the wood, fingers tracing its grain, feet firm on the floor, breath slow, steady, synchronized with the subtle pulse of the night. River, wind, hills, drifting leaf, faint corner shadow, every sound, every motion. Every pause folded into the same patient cadence, carrying the night forward without numbers. Clocks, or measures only attention, only presence. The moonlight shifted imperceptibly. It stretched across benches and floorboards, tracing arcs of dust and shadow, bending and merging slowly, as if following a pattern only it could know. Hills beyond the field were dark, soft shapes. The river whispered through the trees, steady and persistent, and the wind brushed the branches, threading the quiet pulse of the world into the room. Each subtle shift, each whisper of motion, was part of the same unbroken rhythm, a quiet cadence older than memory, yet immediate, alive in its slow unfolding. A leaf drifted across the frost outside. It brushed lightly against the earth, turning in the invisible current of the wind, moving in a small, deliberate arc. The teacher's eyes followed it, tracing its subtle motion without reaching, without naming it. He simply observed, allowing it to exist as part of the unbroken pattern threading moonlight, river, hills, wind, dust, and shadow. The night carried it forward, patient, steady, unhurried, and the teacher remained, pressing lightly to the doorway, fully attentive to the quiet rhythm of everything unfolding round him. And in the corner, the shadow moved again, so slight, so deliberate, tracing the same rhythm as river, wind, hills, moonlight, and drifting dust. The teacher held his gaze on it, hands lightly resting on the doorway, body still, fully present. Moonlight stretched across floorboards, shadows deepened. Dust swirled slowly, the river murmured. The wind brushed the field, and the night continued its patient, unbroken course, carrying every subtle motion, every faint sound, every whisper of presence forward. The shadow lingered for a moment, then shifted again, almost imperceptibly, tracing a path so slight it could have been imagined. The teacher's eyes held it steadily, following its slow, deliberate movement across the floorboards. Moonlight stretched in narrow streaks, touching benches, dust, and the faint impressions of small hands and feet, casting long, delicate shadows that bent and merged imperceptibly outside. The river murmured softly, threading past trees and hills, its cadence patient, constant. Older than memory, the wind brushed through the field, bending frost and grasses in quiet arcs, carrying its subtle motion into the room. Every sound, every subtle shift, every small motion was part of the same persistent rhythm, unbroken. Unhurried, he did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, feet planted firmly on the floor, breath slow and deliberate, synchronized with the subtle pulse of the night. River, wind, hills, drifting leaf, faint corner shadow, presence alone measured time here. Where numbers and clocks had long failed, the night itself carried the rhythm. And he received it fully, silently, patiently. Moonlight shifted imperceptibly. It traced the floorboards and benches, bending round arcs of dust and the impressions left by children. Shadows lengthened and curved, merging and separating in long, deliberate arcs. Hills beyond the field were dark, soft shapes. The river whispered through the trees. The wind brushed branches, threading subtle arcs of motion into the room. The teacher's gaze followed them all, letting them exist, persist, continue without interruption. Even the smallest stirrings, the drifting leaf, the dust. The corner shadow was significant in the patient cadence of the night. He stayed, watching, listening, sensing the slow unfolding of the world. Moonlight, dust, shadows, wind, river. Hills, all threads in a single, unhurried rhythm. Even the smallest strings carried the night forward. Time existed only in attention, in presence, in the quiet acknowledgement of what already was, and the shadow moved again, deliberate, subtle, threading the same rhythm as river, wind, hills, and drifting dust. The teacher's gaze followed it carefully, hands lightly on the doorway, body still, fully present. Moonlight streaked across the floorboards, shadows deepened, dust drifted lazily, river murmured softly, and the night carried on, patient, unbroken, letting each motion, each sound, each whisper of presence continue. The shadow lingered a moment longer, then shifted again, barely enough to disturb the floorboards. The teacher's eyes traced its motion steadily, following the slow, deliberate curve across the room. Moonlight streamed in narrow, silver streaks, touching benches, dust, and the faint impressions left by small hands and feet. Outside, the river murmured quietly, threading past trees and over hills, its rhythm constant and patient. Older than memory, the wind brushed the field softly, bending frost and grasses in gentle arcs, carrying subtle sounds into the room, threading the night's quiet pulse into every corner, every motion, every sound. Every imperceptible stir was part of the same unbroken rhythm. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers brushing the wood, feet planted firmly, breath slow, deliberate, synchronized with the subtle pulse of night. River, wind, hills, drifting leaf. Faint corner shadow, presence alone marked the passage of time here. Where numbers and clocks had long failed, the night itself carried the rhythm. And he received it fully, silently, patiently. The moonlight shifted imperceptibly. It stretched across benches and floorboards, tracing arcs of dust, bending shadows in long, slow lines. Hills beyond the field were soft, dark shapes. The river whispered through the trees. Steady and persistent, the wind pressed gently against branches and leaves, threading subtle arcs of motion into the room. Each small shift the leaf outside. The dust, the corner shadow folded seamlessly into the same patient cadence, carrying night forward. He stayed, watching, listening, feeling the slow unfolding of the world. Moonlight, dust, shadows, wind, river. Hills all threads in a single, unhurried rhythm. Even the smallest stirrings carried the night forward. Time existed only in attention, only in presence, only in the quiet acknowledgement of what already was, and then. The shadow in the corner moved once more, deliberate, subtle, tracing the same rhythm as river. Wind, hills, moonlight, and drifting dust. The teacher's gaze held it steady. Hands lightly on the doorway, body unmoving, fully present. Moonlight stretched across floorboards, shadows deepened. Dust swirled slowly. River murmured faintly. Wind brushed the field, and the night continued its patient, unbroken course, carrying every subtle motion, every faint sound, every whisper of presence forward. The shadow lingered a moment longer, then shifted again. Barely enough to disturb the floorboards. The teacher's eyes traced its motion steadily, following the slow, deliberate curve across the room. Moonlight streamed in narrow, silver streaks, touching benches, dust, and the faint impressions left by small hands and feet outside. The river murmured quietly, threading past trees and over hills, its rhythm constant and patient, older than memory. The wind brushed the field softly, bending frost and grasses in gentle arcs, carrying subtle sounds into the room, threading the night's quiet pulse into every corner, every motion, every sound. Every imperceptible stir was part of the same unbroken rhythm. He did not move. Hands rested lightly on the doorway, fingers brushing the wood, feet planted firmly, breath slow, deliberate, synchronized with the subtle pulse of night. River, wind, hills, drifting leaf, faint corner shadow. Presence alone marked the passage of time here. Where numbers and clocks had long failed, the night itself carried the rhythm. And he received it fully, silently, patiently. The moonlight shifted imperceptibly. It stretched across benches and floorboards, tracing arcs of dust, bending shadows in long, slow lines. Hills beyond the field were soft, dark shapes. The river whispered through the trees. Steady and persistent, the wind pressed gently against branches and leaves, threading subtle arcs of motion into the room. Each small shift the leaf outside. The dust, the corner shadow folded seamlessly into the same patient cadence, carrying night forward. He stayed, watching, listening, feeling the slow unfolding of the world. Moonlight, dust, shadows, wind, river. Hills all threads in a single, unhurried rhythm. Even the smallest stirrings carried the night forward. Time existed only in attention, only in presence, only in the quiet acknowledgement of what already was, and then. The shadow in the corner moved once more, deliberate, subtle, tracing the same rhythm as river. Wind, hills, moonlight, and drifting dust. The teacher's gaze held it steady. Hands lightly on the doorway, body unmoving, fully present. Moonlight stretched across floorboards, shadows deepened. Dust swirled slowly. River murmured faintly. Wind brushed the field, and the night continued its patient, unbroken course, carrying every subtle motion, every faint sound, every whisper of presence forward. A single leaf shifted again outside, brushing the frost, turning in the invisible current of the wind. The movement was so slight it almost seemed imagined. Yet it rippled through the room in quiet arcs, brushing dust, bending shadows, threading into the cadence of the night. The teacher's eyes followed it without reaching. Without naming it, presence alone was enough. The corner shadow moved once more, deliberate and slow. It carried the same rhythm as river and wind, hills and moonlight. The teacher's gaze traced it carefully, hands resting lightly on the doorway, body still. Moonlight stretched across floorboards. Shadows deepened. Dust drifted in silent arcs. River murmured faintly. The wind brushed the field. And the night carried all these motions forward, patient and broken. And then, for a moment, everything paused. The air held still. The dust hovered. The moonlight hung in delicate streaks. Outside, the river softened in its murmur. Wind slackened in the trees. The hills waited quietly, dark and soft. Even the corner shadow seemed to hold its breath, poised on the edge of motion. The teacher remained pressed to the doorway, waiting, watching, listening. Every motion, every whisper, every subtle shift had its place, and he followed them all, fully attentive, as the night continued to unfold around him.